I did not hear the string quartet stop playing. I only heard Valerie's voice cutting through the quiet hum of the ballroom. Security, remove her. The guard stepped forward. His hand clamped onto my silk sleeve. His grip was firm, pressing the fabric into my arm. I did not pull away. I did not raise my voice or ask for an explanation. I simply looked past him, past the tiered champagne tower, and found my father. Richard stood near the podium. He met my eyes for exactly 2 seconds before he looked down and studied the melting ice in his glass. Valerie stepped closer. She smoothed the front of her tailored gown. "This is a closed event for the board," she said, projecting her voice so the group of investors near the bar could hear every syllable. "She is not family." I looked at her face. There was no anger there, only the cold satisfaction of a woman swatting away a pest. I turned my head toward the main entrance. The alcove by the revolving doors was empty. The wall was covered in sleek, sterile chrome panels, reflecting the harsh lobby lights. The antique Nevada silver plaque my mother commissioned 30 years ago, the one with her name engraved on it, was gone. I turned back to the guard. "I can walk myself out," I said. As I moved past the velvet ropes, Valerie was already turning her attention to an investor from Chicago. Her voice dropped to a polished, conspiratorial hum. The original building has had its run. Once the Henderson expansion closes on Friday, we are bulldozing this dinosaur for luxury condos. I handed my ticket to the valet. The desert wind off the strip carried the scent of hot asphalt and dry sage. I stood on the curb and looked up at the neon sign of the solstice. 14 years of swallowing my pride to keep the peace, and this was the price of my silence. Welcome back to Revenge Order. Before we go any further, drop your age in the comments. I was 34 the night I stopped letting other people decide my worth. If a family member has ever tried to erase you from your own history, hit subscribe. You are going to want to hear exactly how this ends. The valet brought my car around. I slid into the driver's seat and pulled out into the Las Vegas traffic. I did not merge onto the highway heading north toward my quiet apartment in Reno. I gripped the steering wheel and took the southbound exit toward Henderson. The dashboard clock glowed bright green in the dark cabin, 11:14. Inside the glove compartment, folded inside a blue linen handkerchief, was a brass safety deposit key. My mother handed it to me 3 days before she died. She told me to wait for a specific night. Tonight was the 30th anniversary of the hotel she built from a patch of dirt and a bank loan. The highway stretched out empty and black. The tires hummed a steady rhythm over the pavement. My phone rested on the passenger seat. It had been quiet all evening. Then the screen flared white in the dark cabin. A text message appeared from an unsaved number. It asked 3 words: "Are you ready?" I stared at the text message on the passenger seat. 3 words: "Are you ready?" I did not reply. I flipped the phone face down and let the desert swallow the silence. The drive from the Las Vegas Strip to Henderson took 30 minutes. The glare of the casino lights faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the flat, dark stretch of the Nevada highway. My mother used to drive this exact route in a beat-up pickup truck when I was 6, hauling drywall and fixtures to the construction site that would eventually become the Solstice. I kept my foot steady on the gas pedal. I pulled into the parking lot of the Henderson First National Bank at 10 minutes past midnight. The branch did not open until 8 in the morning. I parked under the amber glow of a street lamp, leaned the seat back, and watched the digital clock on the dashboard roll forward. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Valerie smoothing her tailored gown. But underneath that memory, an older one surfaced. It was 14 years ago. The oncology ward at Sunrise Hospital. My mother Diane lay propped up against a thin pillow. Her skin had taken on a pale, translucent quality, but her grip on my wrist was iron tight. The machines surrounding her bed beeped in a steady, unyielding rhythm. She pulled me closer. The smell of rubbing alcohol and sterile sheets hung heavy in the air. "Loud people only respect noise, Leah," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, dry like the desert wind, but it carried the weight of a decree. "Valerie is a loud woman. Your father will fold because he hates the noise. When they try to crowd you out, do not scream, do not argue. Quiet people control the paper. Own the paper. She pressed the brass safety deposit key into my palm and closed my fingers over it. I had spent the next 14 years following her final instruction to the letter. I moved 3 hours north to Reno and built a life out of paper. I became a forensic auditor for the State Gaming Commission. My job was to sit in windowless rooms and find the lies hidden inside ledgers. People think fraud is glamorous. It is not. Fraud is tedious. It hides in the margins. Just last month, a high-rolling casino vendor tried to slip a fraudulent $1 million supply contract past my desk. He wore a custom suit, drove an imported sports car, and brought a team of expensive lawyers to the compliance meeting. They presented the contract with a flourish, demanding immediate approval. I did not raise my voice. I did not match their arrogance. I simply pointed to the digital notary stamp on the final page of the contract. The stamp carried a validation code from Washoe County. I cross-referenced the serial number. The clerk who issued that specific digital stamp had retired a full 18 months before the contract was supposedly signed. A backdated digital stamp. A lazy, fatal error. The vendor lost his license, his contract, and his expensive suit in the span of 4 minutes. I learned early on that liars always make a mistake because they focus on the presentation and forget to read the fine print. I am a human lie detector for the fine print. The sky over the mountains shifted from ink black to a pale, bruised purple. The desert cold seeped through the car windows. I drank day-old water from a plastic bottle and watched the bank manager unlock the front doors right at 8 o'clock. I grabbed my coat and the blue linen handkerchief. The air inside the bank smelled like floor wax and filtered air conditioning. I walked straight to the teller window and placed the brass key on the marble counter. The bank manager reviewed my identification. He checked the signature card on file. He nodded, gesturing for me to follow him. We walked past the loan officer desks, down a narrow, carpeted hallway, and into the vault. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind us, muting the ambient noise of the lobby. The air in here was perfectly still. I found box number 412. I inserted my key. The manager inserted his. We turned them simultaneously. The latch released with a sharp metal snap. He slid the long rectangular tin from its slot and carried it to a private viewing booth. He closed the door, leaving me alone. I sat at a small oak table. The metal box felt cold against my fingertips. I expected to find a modest life insurance policy. Maybe a few family photographs Valerie had not managed to throw away. Perhaps a piece of my mother's jewelry. I lifted the lid. The box was practically empty. There were no photographs. There were no velvet jewelry boxes. There was only a thick manila folder and a single letter written on heavy cream stock. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. Sharp, exact, slanting slightly to the right. My mother. I opened the envelope and unfolded the thick paper. Leah, the letter began. If you are reading this, today is the 30th anniversary of the solstice. It also means Valerie finally pushed you out. I knew Richard would not stop her. He is a weak man who prefers a comfortable lie to a difficult truth. I did not leave you a pile of money, sweetheart. Cash can be contested. Cash can be stolen by loud women with expensive lawyers. I left you the foundation. Open the folder. I set the letter aside. My hands did not shake as I untied the string on the manila folder. I opened it and laid the contents flat on the oak table. The first document was not a will. It was not a probate filing. It was a corporate structuring document spanning 40 pages. I read the header. The Solstice Irrevocable Propco Trust. I blinked. My professional training kicked in, rapidly processing the legal jargon. A propco and opco split. My mother had separated the physical real estate from the daily operations of the hotel. The operating company, the entity Valerie controlled and ran, did not own a single brick of the building. They merely leased the land and the trust. And according to the vesting schedule highlighted in yellow on page 3, the sole successor trustee assumed absolute control of the trust on the 30th anniversary of the hotel's founding. Yesterday. I flipped to the next page. A certified bank statement from a reserve account attached to the trust. $18 million in liquid capital, untouched, generating quiet interest for over a decade. Valerie had spent 14 years acting like royalty in a castle she was merely renting. She had thrown me out of a building I technically owned, but my eyes caught a discrepancy on the final page. A lease renewal addendum. The operating company was required to submit annual financial disclosures to the trust. I scanned the numbers. Something was deeply wrong. A massive debt obligation was pending. Attached to the very front of the folder with a paperclip was a thick, embossed business card. Harrison Reed, Independent Fiduciary. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I dialed the number. It rang once. A man answered. His voice was tight, carrying the strain of someone who had been pacing a floor all night. Leah Harrison said before I even introduced myself. I was going to serve you these papers in 3 hours. We have a problem. Valerie is at her commercial lender right now, and she is about to steal the entire property. I kept the phone pressed hard against my ear. The cold steel walls of the vault seemed to narrow around me. I stared at the manila folder on the oak table, tracing the sharp signature my mother had left on the final page of the trust declaration. "What do you mean she is stealing it?" I asked. My voice did not shake. It dropped an octave, settling into the familiar clinical tone I used during hostile compliance audits. "Look at the third section of the ledger," Harrison said. "The line items from the past 6 months." I flipped the heavy pages. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers, skipping over the mundane operating expenses, and landing on the commercial real estate tax disbursements. The pattern broke in October. The monthly lease payments, the rent that the operating company was legally required to pay into the trust, had stopped. A sudden, unexplained diversion of capital. "She is artificially inflating the operating company cash flow," I said, reading the empty columns. "She stopped paying rent to the trust." "Worse," Harrison replied. "She is using those altered ledgers to collateralize a commercial expansion loan, $45 million for a new property in Henderson. The underwriters require physical collateral. Valerie submitted the deed to the Solstice." The air stalled in my lungs. I looked back at the corporate structuring document. My mother had designed a masterpiece of legal architecture, an OpCo and PropCo split. It is a structure used by billionaires to protect their assets from liability, but my mother used it to protect her legacy from vultures. The PropCo, the property company, was the irrevocable trust. It held the deed, it owned the dirt, the concrete foundation, the steel beams, and the roof. The OpCo, the operating company, was nothing more than a tenant. When my mother died, Richard inherited the operating company. He got the payroll headaches, the branding decisions, the staff schedules. The trust kept the physical hotel. For 14 years, Valerie and my father had been running a business inside a building they did not own. They paid rent to a blind trust, likely assuming the funds were locked in some untouchable escrow account, until they decided to sell. They never realized the ghost, collecting their rent, was waiting to hand the keys directly to me on the 30th anniversary of the founding. But if Valerie pledged the hotel as collateral for a new loan, she was committing federal bank fraud. "I have the original deed right here," I told Harrison. "The trust owns the building. The bank will see that during title discovery. The underwriters will reject the loan." "They will not reject it if they think she represents the trust," Harrison said. His breath hitched on the other end of the line. "Get to my office. We are on a ticking clock." I ended the call. I carefully stacked the ledger, the trust declaration, and my mother's letter back into the manila folder. I tied the string closure, placed the folder under my arm, and walked out of the viewing booth. The bank manager met me in the hallway. He offered a polite, practiced smile. I nodded, matching his professional courtesy, and walked out into the blinding Nevada morning. The heat of the parking lot radiated through the soles of my shoes. I got into my car, locked the doors, and set the manila folder on the passenger seat. I merged onto the northbound highway, heading straight for the heart of Las Vegas. During the drive, my mind cataloged the variables. I thought about my father. Richard was a man who navigated life by finding the path of least resistance. He married Valerie barely a year after my mother passed because Valerie took charge. She dictated the schedule. She planned the renovations. She told him what to wear and who to invite to dinner. Richard equated her control with peace. He let her systematically erase my mother's photographs from the hallways of our home. He looked the other way when Valerie moved her own daughter, Skylar, into the master suite and relegated me to a cramped guest room. Richard did not participate in the cruelty, but he permitted it, which is the same thing. Last night at the gala, when Valerie ordered security to remove me, Richard stared at his drink. He chose his own comfort over his daughter. My mother knew he would. That is why she bypassed him entirely. Harrison Reed operated out of a high-rise glass building overlooking the Strip. I bypassed the receptionist, flashed my identification, and was escorted into a corner office overlooking the sprawling desert grid. Harrison stood behind a heavy mahogany desk. He wore a tailored navy suit, but his tie was pulled loose, and a stack of financial printouts covered his blotting pad. He looked at me, taking in my face, searching for a resemblance. "You have her eyes," he said. "Diane was a force of nature. I have guarded this trust for over a decade, waiting for you to come of age and trigger the handover. I just wish the circumstances today were less urgent." "Show me the fraud," I said, taking a seat across from him. I placed my manila folder on the desk. Harrison handed me a stapled packet of loan underwriting documents. He had acquired them through his fiduciary oversight channels. I opened the packet. My eyes locked onto the borrower identification line. Solstice Holdings, LLC. I traced the name with my index finger. "I see it," I murmured. "Valerie incorporated a shell company 3 months ago," Harrison explained, leaning over the desk. "She named it Solstice Holdings, LLC, to intentionally mimic the legal name of your trust, the Solstice Propco Trust. She submitted 14 years of altered tax returns and operating ledgers under this new shell company. The commercial lender is based in Chicago. The underwriter is relying on the digital paperwork Valerie provided. She convinced them that her LLC is the parent company holding the deed." "When does the loan close?" I asked. "Friday morning," Harrison said. 48 hours. If the bank wires the $45 million, they will place a commercial lien on your hotel." Unraveling a fraudulent federal lien takes years of litigation. Valerie knows this. She is gambling that once the money clears, we will be forced to negotiate a settlement to clear the title. She is holding your mother's legacy hostage to fund her own expansion. The audacity of the move was staggering. Valerie relied on noise and spectacle to intimidate people, but she had hired a very quiet, very dangerous lawyer to draft this scheme. I thought about the Chicago investor I overheard at the gala. Valerie promised to bulldoze the original hotel for luxury condos once the Henderson loan cleared. She intended to erase the last physical proof that my mother ever existed. "We cannot fight this in a courtroom," I said, setting the packet down. "By the time a judge grants an injunction, the wire transfer will hit her account. The lien will attach. We have to stop the bank from issuing the funds." "I drafted a cease and desist letter to the lender this morning," Harrison offered. "A cease and desist is a request I countered. A bank underwriter will view it as a family dispute over a corporate asset. They will freeze the process, call Valerie to clarify, and her lawyers will drown the bank in counterclaims. I need something undeniable. I need a kill switch." I tapped my fingers against the mahogany desk. My mind sorted through the architecture of the trust. The operating company was a tenant. Valerie was a renter. "Do you have the original master lease?" I asked. The 40-page contract my mother drafted between the trust and the operating company 14 years ago. Harrison opened a side drawer and produced a thick bound document with a blue legal backing. He slid it across the polished wood. "Every lease has a breach clause," I said, opening the cover. "I just need to find the trap door. If I can legally default her operating lease before the loan closes, the bank cannot fund the expansion. You cannot pledge collateral if you are actively being evicted from the premises." "I need a quiet place to read," I added, standing up and sliding the heavy document into my bag. As I turned toward the office door, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The screen lit up with a new text message. The sender was Valerie. "I know you are upset about last night," the message read. "Let us handle this like adults. I will buy out your mother's old $10,000 culinary fund if you sign a standard non-disparagement agreement today. Let us move on." I stared at the glowing text. A sudden, sharp clarity settled over me. Valerie thought I was a greedy, discarded child who could be bought off with pocket change. She thought she was negotiating from a position of power. She had no idea she was texting her landlord. I stepped out of the glass office building and into the brutal midday heat of the Las Vegas Strip. The desert sun baked the concrete sidewalks, radiating upward and blurring the horizon line in a wavy haze. I carried the blue-bound master lease under my arm. The weight of the document felt grounding. It was a physical anchor in a morning that had otherwise spun out of control. I needed a place to sit somewhere loud enough to offer anonymity, but disconnected from the corporate sterility of Harrison Reed and his mahogany desk. 2 blocks down the avenue, sandwiched between a discount souvenir shop and a pawnbroker, I found a narrow diner. The neon sign hanging in the window hummed a low, erratic buzz. I pushed through the glass door. The air inside smelled of burnt coffee, fried onions, and old leather booth seating. A waitress in a faded pink apron pointed to an empty table near the back corner. I slid into the vinyl booth, placing the thick contract flat on the laminate surface. I ordered a black coffee and asked her to leave the pot. My phone rested next to the bound pages. The screen remained dark, but the memory of Valerie and her text message gnawed at the edges of my focus. She had offered to buy out my mother's old culinary charity fund for $10,000. In exchange, she demanded my signature on a non-disparagement agreement. I traced the rim of my ceramic coffee mug, analyzing the psychology behind her offer. Valerie did not do anything out of sudden generosity. Every move she made was calculated. She knew she had orchestrated a public spectacle at the Gala the night before. She also knew the commercial lender in Chicago was finalizing the paperwork for the new expansion. During the final 48 hours of a multi-million-dollar loan underwriting process, compliance officers run background checks. They look for pending litigation, public disputes, or disgruntled family members who might muddy the title. Valerie was tying up loose ends. She assumed I was a struggling state employee living in a cramped Reno apartment, eager to accept a quick payout. $10,000 was a carefully chosen number. To a wealthy person, it is a rounding error. To a person living paycheck to paycheck, it is a lifeline. She thought she was throwing a bone to a stray dog. More importantly, the non-disparagement agreement would legally gag me. If I signed it, I could never speak to the Chicago lender, the press, or the hotel investors without triggering a ruinous financial penalty. She was trying to blindfold me before I even knew there was a robbery taking place. I turned the phone face down on the laminate table. The screen clicked against the hard surface. I was not going to sign her gag order. I was going to dismantle her entire operation. I opened the blue-bound cover of the master agreement. The crisp white pages were filled with dense 12-point legal font. For most people, reading a commercial real estate contract is a potent sedative. For me, it is a map. My mother taught me how to read these maps when I was a teenager. She used to spread her vendor contracts across our kitchen table, handing me a highlighter and telling me to find the hidden costs. She said lawyers bury their best tricks in the middle of long paragraphs because they know human attention spans are fragile. I took a pen from my bag and began to read. I treated the document like any other forensic audit. I ignored the preamble and the standard definitions, driving straight into the operational mechanics. My mind mapped the architecture of the crime Valerie was attempting. The Chicago underwriter was lazy. In the era of digital banking, lenders often rely on automated algorithms to verify tax returns and corporate filings. Valerie had incorporated Solstice Holdings, LLC, just a few months ago. She gave her shell company a name nearly identical to the true property owner, the Solstice Propco Trust. When the Chicago loan officer requested proof of ownership, Valerie likely provided a modified operating agreement and a series of tax documents filed under her new LLC. She probably used a friendly title agent to obscure the true deed history, promising them a kickback once the expansion funds cleared. It was a staggering grift. If the wire transfer went through on Friday morning, the Chicago bank would secure their debt by placing a federal lien against the physical hotel. Once a commercial lien attaches to a property, removing it requires a judge, a trial, and years of forensic untangling. During that time, Valerie would use the stolen funds to build her new luxury high-rise in Henderson. She would leave my mother's original building locked in a legal purgatory, slowly rotting until the city condemned it. I checked my watch. 1:15 in the afternoon. The wire transfer was scheduled for Friday at 9 in the morning. I had roughly 43 hours to detonate a bomb inside Valerie's flawless scheme. I could not rely on Harrison sending a polite warning letter to the bank. I needed an immediate lethal strike. I needed to evict the operating company before the sun came up on Friday. I scanned the default provisions in Section 8 of the contract. My eyes tracked line by line. Every lease contains rules for termination. The problem was the cure period. If a tenant fails to pay rent, the landlord must issue a notice and grant them 30 days to cure the missing payment. If a tenant fails to maintain adequate insurance, they get a 10-day cure period to produce a valid policy. A 30-day cure period was useless to me. Even a 10-day window meant Valerie would receive the loan funds before the eviction finalized. I needed a 0-day cure period. I needed an incurable default, an infraction so severe that the landlord possessed the right to terminate the agreement the second the violation occurred, without offering the tenant a chance to fix it. I turned the page. The diner around me faded into a dull, rhythmic background noise. The clattering plates, the murmur of the waitresses, the hum of the neon sign, all of it disappeared. I fell into the deep, silent tunnel of the text. Section 10 covered structural modifications. Section 12 covered subleasing restrictions. None of them contained a 0-day cure period. My heart beat a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I turned another page. I reached Section 14. The header read, Covenants of the Tenant Regarding Aesthetic and Historical Preservation. I stopped. I read the header again. My mother was a brilliant businesswoman, but she was also deeply sentimental about her roots. She built the Solstice from the ground up, honoring the Nevada desert and the miners who settled the region. She despised corporate sterility. She hated the cheap reflective surfaces and soulless designs that dominated the modern casino landscape. I traced my pen beneath the first paragraph of Section 14. The text stipulated that the tenant must maintain the original architectural character of the lobby. It mandated the upkeep of the desert stone flooring and the exposed timber beams. Then I reached subsection B. I read the paragraph once. I stopped breathing. I read it a second time to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. My mother, anticipating that someone might eventually try to erase her legacy, had written a highly specific, unbreakable rule into the foundation of the lease. The text was undeniable. The operating company must permanently maintain the founder's original Nevada silver plaque in the main lobby alcove. Altering, covering, or removing the plaque without the express written consent of the property owner constitutes a material and uncurable breach of this agreement. Upon such breach, the landlord reserves the unilateral right to terminate the lease, immediately severing all tenant rights to the premises. An uncurable breach, a 0-day eviction. I sat back against the vinyl booth. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. A memory from the night before flashed behind my eyes. I was standing in the grand lobby waiting for the valet. The alcove near the revolving doors was covered in sleek, reflective chrome panels. The heavy engraved silver plaque that had hung there for 3 decades was gone. Mallory, in her desperate rush to modernize the brand and erase my mother from the building, had ordered a renovation. She tore the plaque down to install a cheap mirror. She thought she was remodeling a wall. She did not realize she was triggering the self-destruct sequence on her own empire. She had handed me the exact weapon I needed. I reached for my phone, flipping it face up. I opened a new message to Harrison Reed. I typed a single sentence. I found the kill switch. Get the lender contact information ready. I pulled my laptop from my leather tote bag and set it flat on the diner table, pushing the ceramic coffee mug out of the way. The vinyl booth squeaked as I adjusted my posture. The diner hummed with the clatter of silverware and the low murmur of afternoon patrons, but my focus narrowed entirely to the glowing screen in front of me. I opened a blank word processing document. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Drafting a legal death warrant requires a clinical detachment. I typed the heading in bold, capitalized letters: Formal Notice of Incurable Default and Immediate Lease Termination. Below the header, I listed the parties: the Solstice Propco Trust as the landlord, the Solstice Operating Company as the tenant. My mind returned to the missing object that made this entire execution possible. Nevada silver is not a decorative afterthought. It is pulled directly from the local dirt, refined through intense heat, and cast with purpose. It tarnishes if neglected. It demands constant polishing, attention, and respect. It is a heavy, enduring element. My mother chose silver for her founding plaque because she wanted a monument that required hard work to maintain, much like the hotel itself. Valerie preferred chrome. Chrome is nothing but a microscopic veneer sprayed over cheap, hollow alloy. It is sterile. It reflects the surface to distract you from the lack of substance underneath. When Valerie ordered the lobby renovation 6 months ago, she was not just updating the decor. She was staging a visual coup. She stripped away the heavy, tarnished history of the woman who built the empire and replaced it with a reflective mirror that only showed Valerie her own image. By prioritizing her vanity, my stepmother had unknowingly tripped the wire on an uncurable eviction clause. I typed out the specific citation. Pursuant to Section 14, Subsection B of the Master Lease Agreement dated October 12, 2008. I detailed the unauthorized removal of the historical marker. I stated that the operating company had materially breached the core aesthetic covenant. I concluded the document with the penalty phase, declaring the lease null and void, demanding the immediate surrender of the premises. I saved the document as a secure file and picked up my phone. I dialed Harrison Reed. He answered on the second ring. "Tell me you found something," he said. "I found a 0-day cure provision," I replied. Section 14B. The silver plaque in the lobby alcove. Valerie took it down during her remodel. The lease strictly prohibits its removal without the written consent of the property owner. The penalty is immediate termination of the tenancy. I heard the rustle of heavy paper on the other end of the line. Harrison was flipping through his copy of the master agreement. A long, heavy silence stretched across the connection. Then a low exhale of breath. "Your mother was a ghost who saw the future," Harrison whispered. "It is ironclad. It is an aesthetic covenant tied directly to the possession rights. If Valerie removed that marker, she effectively handed you the keys to the front door." "I have the notice of default drafted," I told him. "I need the direct contact information for the lead underwriter at the Chicago bank. I also need the email addresses for the hotel board of investors. We are not going to mail this to Valerie. If we send it to her, she will hide it and try to force the loan through anyway. We are going to bypass her entirely and drop this directly onto the desks of the people holding the checkbook." Harrison read the email addresses to me over the phone. I typed them into the recipient line. Next, I attached the formal notice of default. Then, I attached the original deed proving the trust owned the physical real estate. Finally, I attached the newly signed acceptance of trusteeship. That last signature was the final key turning in the lock. By signing it, I formally stepped into my role. I was no longer the discarded daughter sitting in a cheap diner. I was the landlord of a multi-million-dollar Las Vegas estate. "Are you prepared for the fallout?" Harrison asked. The tone of his voice was solemn. "Once you hit send, the Chicago lender will freeze the underwriting process. They will contact the investors. The board will panic. Valerie is going to realize her entire reality is collapsing in real time." "I am prepared for the truth to be the truth," I said. I pressed the send button. A small digital swoosh sounded from the laptop speakers. The screen confirmed the delivery. The dossier was gone, flying through secure servers, landing in the inboxes of federal bankers and wealthy venture capitalists halfway across the country. The bomb was in the air. I closed the laptop, placed a $10 bill on the table to cover the cold coffee, and walked out into the desert heat. The drive from Las Vegas to Reno takes 7 hours. I spent the entire journey bathed in a profound, unfamiliar silence. I did not turn on the radio. I watched the topography change through the windshield. The neon excess of the strip faded into the barren scrub brush plains of the high desert. The jagged mountain peaks cast long shadows across the highway as the sun began its slow descent in the west. For the first time in 14 years, my shoulders dropped. The constant low-grade tension I had carried since the day my mother died began to evaporate. I had spent my entire adult life trying to shrink myself to avoid provoking Valerie. I had allowed her to crop me out of family portraits, exclude me from holiday dinners, and eventually order a guard to physically remove me from a public room. I had called my passivity dignified. I realized now it was merely surrender. Today, I stopped surrendering. I drew a line in the sand, using a legal contract and a signature. I pulled into the parking lot of my Reno apartment complex just after 1 in the afternoon. The air here was cooler, carrying the scent of pine needles from the nearby foothills. My apartment was on the second floor of a quiet brick building. It was modest. It had hardwood floors that creaked near the hallway, a small kitchen with butcher block counters, and a window that looked out over a neighborhood park. It was nothing like the sprawling, opulent mansion Richard and Valerie occupied in Henderson. But it was mine. I paid the rent with money I earned auditing corrupted ledgers. No one could ever change the locks on this door. I unlocked the deadbolt and stepped inside. The familiar scent of old books and chamomile greeted me. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. I walked into the kitchen, filled the electric kettle with tap water, and pressed the switch down. The heating element began to hum. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and set it face up on the kitchen counter. The screen was dark. The silence of the apartment felt heavy and rich. I leaned against the counter, watching the first wisps of steam rise from the spout of the kettle. I took a deep, grounding breath. The game was over. I had secured my perimeter. I had protected my mother's legacy. Then the digital clock on the microwave clicked to 1:14 in the afternoon. The phone on the counter vibrated, a harsh, sustained buzz that rattled the device against the butcher block. The screen illuminated, casting a harsh, white glare against the kitchen tiles. I looked down. The caller identification displayed the name of the Hotel General Counsel. I did not pick it up. I watched it ring until the call went to voicemail. 3 seconds later, the phone vibrated again. A different number. Richard. The buzzing persisted, frantic and demanding. The screen went dark, only to flare bright a moment later. Another call. Then a text message. Then 2 more calls in rapid succession. The device began to dance across the wood surface, caught in a relentless mechanical seizure. The silence of my sanctuary shattered. The fallout had arrived. The device on my butcher block counter did not stop shaking. The vibration motor buzzed a relentless mechanical rhythm against the wood, inching the phone closer to the edge with every incoming notification. I stood by the sink and watched the screen illuminate my dark kitchen. The numbers climbed in rapid succession. 12 missed calls, 28, 41. By the time the electric kettle clicked off, the counter read 57 missed calls. 57 attempts to breach my quiet life. For 14 years, the communication from Henderson had been non-existent. They never called on my birthday. They never called during the holidays. The silence they offered me was designed to make me feel small, to remind me that I existed outside the perimeter of their wealthy reality. Now the dynamic had inverted. The silence belonged to me, and it was driving them insane. I poured the boiling water into my ceramic mug. The scent of chamomile rose in the steam. I picked up the phone, unlocked the screen, and navigated to the voicemail inbox. I did not feel the familiar anxiety that used to knot my stomach whenever Valerie entered a room. I felt the clinical detachment of a forensic auditor sitting down to review a corrupted ledger. I tapped the first audio file. The voice belonged to Marcus Thorne, the general counsel for the operating company. He spoke with the clipped, aggressive cadence of a man accustomed to bullying subordinates. "Leah, this is Marcus Thorne. You need to contact my office immediately. We received a highly irregular and legally dubious communication from your representative. Your fraudulent filings with the Chicago lender are tortious interference with a commercial transaction. If you do not formally retract this default notice within the hour, we will pursue severe damages." I took a slow sip of my tea. Marcus Thorne relied on intimidation. Corporate attorneys use terms like tortious interference the way playground bullies use their fists. They assume the average citizen will panic at the threat of a lawsuit. Marcus did not realize I spent my weekdays dismantling legal threats from casino executives. His bluster meant nothing. The lease was a binding contract. He could threaten me all he wanted, but he could not alter the ink on the page. I swiped left. Delete. I tapped the next audio file. This one was from Richard. My father did not sound angry. He sounded like a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship, watching the water rise over his polished shoes. The background noise on his recording was chaotic. I could hear papers shuffling and muffled shouting from another room. "Leah, please pick up the phone," Richard stammered. His breath caught in his throat. "The bank just called us. The underwriter froze the entire account. The investors are demanding an emergency meeting." "What did you send them? Valerie is losing her mind down here. Please just call me back so we can fix this. Do not do this to the family." I closed my eyes. The word family hung in the air, hollow and useless. Richard always invoked the concept of family when he needed me to absorb a burden. He spent his entire life retreating to his private study whenever conflict arose, preferring to let other people handle the wreckage. Now the wreckage had landed directly on his desk, and his study could not protect him. He was terrified because the illusion of control was gone. He wanted me to fix it. He wanted me to go back to being the quiet, invisible daughter so he could return to his comfortable, passive existence. I felt a brief pang of sorrow for him, not because he was losing his hotel, but because he was so thoroughly broken. I swiped left. Delete. The final block of voicemails belonged to Valerie. There were 9 in total. I listened to them in chronological order, tracking the rapid deterioration of her high society persona. The first message was an exercise in extreme manipulation. Her voice poured through the speaker, dripping with artificial honey. "Leah, sweetheart, there has been a terrible misunderstanding with the bank. I know you are confused about the trust documents. Let us sit down over lunch tomorrow. I will write you a very generous check to settle this silly dispute. Call me, honey." I set my mug on the counter. Narcissists always begin with a bribe disguised as affection. When they realize their charm is ineffective, the mask begins to slip. The fourth voicemail was shorter, the honey replaced by a sharp edge of irritation. "Leah, this is not a game. You are embarrassing your father in front of his colleagues. Answer the phone." By the 9th voicemail, the mask had shattered entirely. The audio distorted, peaking the small speaker on my phone. Valerie was screaming. The pristine, tailored woman who commanded ballrooms and directed security guards was gone, replaced by a cornered predator. "You little nothing," Valerie shrieked. "You think a piece of paper makes you important? You think you can steal my brand? I built this empire. I will drag you through the courts until you are bankrupt. I will destroy you. You do not own this hotel. You hear me? You own nothing." I let the recording play out until the digital beep signaled the end of the message. The venom in her voice was visceral, but it held no power in my kitchen. Valerie was screaming into a void. She had spent a decade building an identity around a physical property, tying her entire self-worth to the chrome signage and the luxury expansion. Without the hotel, she was just a loud woman standing in an empty room. I pressed delete. The digital trash bin swallowed her rage. The silence returned thick and peaceful. I looked out the window. The sun had dipped below the tree line of the park, casting long, bruised shadows across the grass. The adrenaline that had fueled me since the gala began to recede, leaving behind a heavy, aching exhaustion. I had been awake for 36 hours. I had driven across the state, opened a hidden vault, deciphered a complex real estate trust, and detonated a federal loan scheme. I leaned against the butcher block counter and exhaled. The victory settled over my shoulders like a warm blanket. The bank had stopped the wire. The $45 million expansion was dead. Valerie and Richard were exposed to their investors. The aesthetic covenant my mother drafted had worked flawlessly. The hotel was safe from the bulldozers. Tomorrow, I would instruct Harrison to begin the formal eviction proceedings to remove the operating company from the premises. Tonight, I was going to sleep. I picked up my tea and walked toward the short hallway leading to my bedroom. I reached out to flick off the overhead kitchen light. The phone on the counter rang again. It was not a text. It was not a flurry of rapid notifications. It was a single, sustained ringtone. I paused my hand hovering over the light switch. I looked back at the screen. The caller identification displayed Harrison Reed. A cold prickle of intuition ran down my spine. Harrison did not call after business hours unless the architecture of the trust was under threat. I set my mug down. I walked back to the counter and picked up the device. I tapped the green icon and brought the speaker to my ear. "Harrison," I said, "we did it. The bank froze the wire." He did not offer congratulations. He did not say hello. The background noise on his end of the line was eerily silent, devoid of the usual rustling papers or office ambiance. Leah Harrison said. His voice was flat, carrying a metallic edge of dread. "Turn on your computer right now." I frowned, my brow furrowing in the dim light of the kitchen. "What is wrong? Has the lender requested more documentation?" "The lender has resumed the underwriting process," Harrison replied. "The wire transfer is back on schedule for Friday morning." I gripped the edge of the butcher block counter. The wood felt rough under my fingertips. "That is impossible. I sent them the notice of default. The lease is terminated. They cannot fund a loan against a property caught in an active eviction." "Valerie hired a crisis litigator," Harrison said, the words spilling out in a rushed, tight cadence. "They bypassed the Chicago lender entirely and went straight to the Nevada District Court. They filed an emergency injunction 10 minutes ago. An injunction based on what I demanded." My heart began to hammer against my ribs, replacing the exhaustion with a fresh surge of adrenaline. "She has no standing. The trust is irrevocable." "She filed a counterstrike," Harrison said. "They produced a First Amendment to the trust. The document is heavily notarized. According to the text, your mother revoked your status as successor trustee shortly before she died. The amendment strips you of all authority and hands absolute, unchecked control of the real estate directly to Richard." The kitchen seemed to tilt. The shadows stretched longer across the floor. "The judge granted a temporary freeze on your authority based on the filing," Harrison continued. "You are locked out, Leah. The default notice is legally void. Valerie controls the board again. We have lost the hotel." I stared at the screen of my phone until it faded to black. The butcher block counter dug into my palms. I pressed my weight against the wood, trying to stop the sudden vertigo spinning the kitchen around me. "A First Amendment," I repeated. The words tasted like ash. "Irrevocable trusts do not have amendments, Harrison. That is the definition of irrevocable." "They do if the amendment predates the triggering event," Harrison replied. "The filing claims your mother drafted and signed the revision in October 2012. It asserts that she reconsidered the succession plan during her final months. The document revokes your status entirely. It names Richard as the sole authority, granting him full power to encumber, lease, or liquidate the real estate." I closed my eyes. The image of my mother in that hospital bed surfaced again. But the memory was warped now. 2012 was the year the cancer metastasized. It was a year defined by grueling chemotherapy rounds, fractured sleep, and a haze of prescription painkillers. She was fragile. Her legendary resolve had fractured under the weight of the illness. Did she change her mind? Did Richard sit beside her bed holding her thin hand and whisper that a young girl could not possibly manage a commercial empire? Did he convince her that he was the safer bet? My chest tightened. The air in the apartment felt thin and recycled. For 14 years, I survived the isolation of Reno by holding on to a single truth. I believed my mother saw my worth, anticipated my exile, and built a legal fortress to protect me. If she signed that amendment, the fortress was an illusion. I was not the secret heir waiting in the wings. I was just the discarded daughter she forgot to protect at the finish line. The Nevada district judge granted a temporary restraining order based on the filing. Harrison continued pulling me back to the present. The order suspends your fiduciary access pending a full evidentiary hearing. I just received the notice from the court clerk. My hands are tied, Leah. I cannot act on your behalf while the injunction is active. What about the lender? I asked. My voice sounded hollow, stripped of the authority it carried an hour ago. Valerie sent the injunction directly to the Chicago underwriter, Harrison said. Banks despise liability, but they love closing fees. The injunction gives the lender the legal cover they need to ignore your notice of default. As far as the bank is concerned, your authority is disputed, and Richard is the reinstated trustee. They put the expansion loan back into the active queue. The wire transfer is set to clear tomorrow morning at 9. Tomorrow morning. Less than 24 hours. We need to challenge the injunction, I said. We file a motion to quash. We cannot get a hearing before Tuesday, Harrison replied. The courts are clogged. By the time we stand in front of a judge, the $45 million will be in Valerie's operating account. The commercial lien will be permanently attached to the Solstice. Even if we win the hearing next week, the property will be encumbered by federal debt. Valerie will take the cash and start building her Henderson high-rise. You will be left fighting a decade-long title dispute over a hotel you cannot afford to maintain. The trap had snapped shut. I had spent the afternoon reading the master lease, searching for a flaw in Valerie's armor. I never considered that her lawyers were bypassing the lease entirely to attack the root of the trust. Send me the filing, I said. I want to see the document. I want to see her signature. I am pulling the digital scan from the county database right now, Harrison said. I will email it to your secure server. Leah, I am sorry. We outplayed them on the board, but they flipped the table. The line went dead. I lowered the phone. The screen faded to black, leaving me in the dim shadows of the kitchen. I walked into the living room and sat on the edge of the sofa. The Nevada sun had fully set, plunging the park outside my window into darkness. Street lamps flickered to life, casting long yellow pools of light across the pavement. I did not turn on my lamps. I sat in the dark and listened to the floorboards settle. The victory I felt an hour ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. I thought about the Chicago investors celebrating the closing. I thought about the bulldozers rolling onto the property, tearing through the desert stone flooring and the exposed timber beams my mother had sourced herself. I pictured the heavy silver plaque melting down in a scrapyard, her name erased permanently from the city grid. Valerie had won. She possessed the hotel, the expansion funds, and the social victory. She had reduced me to the exact person she always claimed I was. A nuisance. A ghost. I opened my laptop. The screen cast a blue glow across the room. I refreshed my email inbox, waiting for Harrison to send the court filing. The loading icon spun in a continuous, mocking circle. The silence of the apartment was no longer a sanctuary. It felt like a cage. I was trapped inside it, paralyzed by the court order, forced to watch the clock count down to my own defeat. I stared at the spinning icon, wondering if I should just close the laptop, pack my bags, and drive further north. Leave the state. Leave the memory behind. If my mother truly signed that paper in 2012, I had no obligation to fight for a legacy that was revoked. A sound broke through my spiraling thoughts. It was faint at first, the heavy wooden groan of the exterior stairs leading up to my second-floor landing. I lived in a quiet building. My neighbors were retired teachers and traveling nurses who walked with soft, considerate steps. These footsteps were different. They were sharp, deliberate, and numerous. multiple people ascending the staircase, their shoes striking the wood with a determined rhythm. I closed the laptop screen. The living room plunged back into darkness. The footsteps stopped directly outside my front door. I held my breath. I listened to the faint rustle of fabric, a low whisper in the corridor. Then the silence shattered. A fist struck the wooden door, 3 rapid, heavy blows that rattled the hinges and vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet. I did not move. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Open the door, Leah," a voice demanded through the wood. It was Valerie. Her tone lacked the artificial sweetness of her earlier voicemails. It was raw, triumphant, and laced with venom. I stood up. The hardwood creaked under my weight. I moved silently across the living room, stepping around the area rug, closing the distance to the entryway. The ceramic bowl holding my keys rattled slightly as another barrage of knocks struck the exterior. "We know you are in there," Valerie said. "The light from your computer was shining through the blinds. Open the door before I call the police and have you arrested for fraud." I reached the door. I pressed my palm flat against the cool wood, steadying my trembling hands. I leaned forward and pressed my eye to the small glass peephole. The corridor light illuminated the scene with a harsh yellow glare. Valerie stood dead center on my welcome mat. She wore a tailored crimson coat, her posture rigid, her chin tilted upward in total defiance. She looked like a queen surveying a conquered province. To her left stood Skylar. My stepsister held her smartphone, up the camera lens pointed directly at my door, the red recording light blinking steadily. She was waiting to capture my humiliation, ready to broadcast my defeat to their social circles. To Valerie's right stood Richard. My father looked at the ground, his shoulders slumped, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his slacks. He refused to look at the peephole. He was a silent accessory to the home invasion, dragged along to witness the execution. They had breached my perimeter. They had driven 3 hours through the desert night to deliver the final blow in person. The sanctuary was broken. I stepped back from the door. I looked at the deadbolt. It was a standard brass lock, sturdy enough to keep out a stranger, but entirely useless against the people who held the title to my history. They were not going to leave. They were going to stand in that hallway until I faced them. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the scent of old books and cold tea into my lungs. I unlocked the deadbolt and turned the handle. I opened the door. The cold corridor air rushed into my apartment, carrying the scent of expensive perfume and nervous sweat. Valerie did not wait for an invitation. She stepped across the threshold, forcing me to step back to avoid a physical collision. Her crimson coat rustled as she marched past the entryway and directly into the center of my living room. She moved with the aggressive entitlement of a woman who believed she owned the floorboards beneath her feet. Skylar followed close behind. She kept her smartphone raised at chest level, the camera lens tracking my face. Her expression was a mix of boredom and cruel anticipation. She wanted a performance. She wanted tears shouting and a complete breakdown that she could play for her friends over expensive cocktails. Richard entered last. He crossed the threshold, slowly closing the door behind him with a soft, apologetic click. He did not look at me. He stared at a framed print on my wall, his jaw tight, his hands still buried in his pockets. He looked exactly the way he did 14 years ago in the hospital waiting room, a passenger in his own life. I stood by the front door. The apartment, my quiet sanctuary, suddenly felt incredibly small. The space was filled with their presence, their noise, their demands. "You really thought you could outsmart me with a lease loophole?" Valerie sneered. She turned to face me, planting her expensive heels on my area rug. "You thought you could hide in Reno for a decade and then steal my brand with a technicality?" I did not answer. I maintained a steady, even gaze, letting her hostility bounce off a wall of silence. I learned long ago that reacting to a narcissist only fuels their adrenaline. Valerie unclasped her leather handbag. She pulled out a thick, stapled document and tossed it onto my butcher block kitchen island. The paper slid across the wood, stopping inches from my ceramic tea mug. "That is the court order," Valerie said, her voice rising in pitch, filling the small room. "And underneath it is the First Amendment your mother signed. It revokes your succession. It gives total control back to Richard, where it belongs. You tried to commit federal bank fraud today, Leah. You filed a false eviction notice to sabotage a commercial loan. My attorneys are preparing criminal charges for tortious interference. You are looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Prison time. Federal charges. Valerie was dropping a nuclear payload on my living room floor. She wanted me to panic. She wanted me to break down in front of Skylar's camera and beg for mercy. "Sign the release waiver," Valerie commanded. She pointed a manicured finger at the document on the island. "Sign the waiver right now, releasing all claims to the trust and acknowledging the amendment is valid. If you sign it, I will tell my lawyers to drop the criminal charges. We close the loan tomorrow morning, and you go back to whatever sad little life you live up here. If you refuse, I am calling the police the second we leave this building." I looked at the document resting on the butcher block. The pages glowed under the recessed kitchen lighting. It was a terrifying ultimatum. Sign away my mother's legacy, or face the crushing weight of a corporate legal team determined to put me behind bars. The pressure in the room was immense. The air felt thick, charged with static electricity. I looked past Valerie and found my father. "Dad," I said. My voice was calm, a stark contrast to Valerie's shrieking. "Did you know she was bringing this here?" Richard flinched. He finally pulled his gaze away from the wall print and looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at Valerie, then back to the floor. He knew this was wrong. He knew my mother never intended for him to control the property. But his fear of Valerie's rage was greater than his love for his daughter. His silence was a complete, devastating answer. "Stop looking at him," Valerie snapped, stepping between us. "He cannot save you. He works for me. Everyone works for me. Sign the paper." I broke eye contact with my father. I turned my attention to the butcher block island. I walked slowly into the kitchen, ignoring Skylar's camera tracking my every movement. I did not reach for a pen. I did not cry. I leaned over the counter and looked at the stapled packet. When you audit thousands of corrupted ledgers, you develop a specific kind of vision. You stop seeing the entire page and start seeing the anomalies. Your brain filters out the bold headers and the aggressive legal threats. You look for the scenes. You look for the places where the lie was stitched together. I ignored the court injunction on the top of the stack. I flipped it over, revealing the First Amendment to the trust. The document was dense with legalese, claiming my mother had reconsidered her succession plan in October of 2012. I read the text, my eyes scanning the paragraphs. Valerie continued to yell from the living room, berating my career, my apartment, my existence. The noise became a dull drone in the background. My focus narrowed to the ink on the page. I reached the bottom of the document. There was a signature line. Above it, a surprisingly accurate forgery of my mother's handwriting. Valerie had likely paid a professional a substantial sum to replicate the sharp, exact slant of the letters. It was a good fake, good enough to pass a casual inspection by a busy judge or a lazy bank underwriter. But a signature requires authentication. A legal trust amendment involving commercial real estate must be witnessed and sealed by a state official. My eyes dropped below the signature line. I found the notary seal. It was a standard circular blue ink stamp. The text around the perimeter read, Washoe County, State of Nevada. In the center, it displayed the notary public's name and their commission expiration date. I stared at the blue ink. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to amplify in the silence of my own mind. A slow, chilling realization began to wash over me, starting at the base of my neck and radiating down my spine. My breathing slowed. The crushing pressure in my chest vanished, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. The trap Valerie built was flawless on the surface, but the foundation was rotten. I leaned closer to the paper, inspecting the fine details of the stamp. I remembered the casino vendor I busted last month. the man in the expensive suit who tried to pass a fraudulent $1 million supply contract. I remembered the exact reason his forgery failed. He used a backdated digital stamp belonging to a clerk who had already retired. Valerie's lawyer had made a similar fatal error, but they did not use a digital stamp. They used a physical ink seal. I straightened my posture. I did not touch the document. I turned around to face the living room. Valerie was standing with her arms crossed, her face flushed with victory. She thought she was witnessing my surrender. Skylar adjusted her grip on her phone, leaning in to capture my response. "Are you done reading?" Valerie asked, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "Where is your pen?" I looked directly into her eyes. The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently, I could almost feel the air pressure change. The fear was gone. I was no longer the frightened daughter cornered in her apartment. I was the forensic auditor, and I had just found the lie. "I am not going to sign your waiver," I said. My voice was steady, resonant, carrying the absolute authority of the truth. Valerie's smile vanished. "Then I will call the police," she stated, reaching for her own phone in her handbag. "Go ahead," I replied, taking a step away from the kitchen island. "Dial the number. But before you invite law enforcement into this room, you should know exactly what you just placed on my counter." Valerie paused, her hand hovering over her bag. "What are you talking about?" I pointed to the document. "You came into my home and threatened me with federal prison time based on this amendment. You presented it to a district judge. You submitted it to a commercial lender in Chicago to secure a $45 million wire transfer. You built an entire legal strategy on the authenticity of this paper. It is authentic." Valerie snapped through a flicker of uncertainty flashed in her eyes. "Your mother signed it." "No, she did not," I said, taking another step forward. "You paid a desperate lawyer to forge her signature. And he did a decent job with the handwriting, but your lawyer was sloppy. He was so focused on making the signature look right that he forgot to check the historical registry for the notary seal." The room went entirely still. Skylar lowered her phone an inch. Richard finally looked up from the floor, his eyes widening. I gestured to the blue ink stamp at the bottom of the page. "That amendment is dated October 12th, 2012. But the Washoe County notary stamp authenticating the signature belongs to a clerk named David Aris." I locked eyes with Valerie. "I audit Washoe County municipal ledgers for a living, Valerie. I know the registry. David Aris did not pass his state notary examination until August of 2015. Valerie stopped breathing. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and drawn under the harsh corridor light spilling through the open doorway. "He could not have stamped a document in 2012. I continued, driving the nail deeper into the coffin. "You did not bring leverage into my home tonight, Valerie. You brought a fabricated legal instrument. You crossed state lines with a forged document intended to secure a fraudulent federal loan. You brought a felony confession, and you dropped it right on my kitchen counter." The room settled into a stillness so profound I could hear the faint whir of the refrigerator compressor behind me. I watched the realization move across Valerie's features. It was not a sudden shock. It was a slow, agonizing descent as the mathematics of her mistake computed in real time. Her jaw slackened. The polished armor she wore, the societal armor funded by my mother's sweat, fractured. Skylar lowered her smartphone. The red recording light dipped toward the floorboards. She was a 24-year-old woman who had never faced a consequence in her life, shielded by her mother's wealth. Now she was holding digital evidence of an extortion attempt. She tapped the screen, terminating the video, and slid the device into her pocket. She took a half step backward, distancing herself from the kitchen island, distancing herself from the crime. I did not raise my voice to fill the quiet. I kept my tone level, measured, and factual. "Forgery is a desperate man's game, Valerie. Your attorney needed to generate a timeline that predated my mother's passing. He drafted the text. He printed it on aged paper. He likely sourced a vintage ink pen for the signature. but he was careless with the authentication. State registries are public record. David Aris took his oath of office in the summer of 2015. A document cannot be notarized by a ghost 3 years before they receive their seal. Valerie opened her mouth, but only a sharp intake of air escaped. Her eyes darted from the paper to my face and back again. I stepped closer to the butcher block counter. I tapped my index finger against a blank space near the bottom margin. But the notary stamp is only the first failure, I continued. You forgot the fundamental architecture of an irrevocable trust. My mother did not trust Richard to guard the henhouse, and she certainly did not trust you. She anticipated that someone might try to coerce a signature or fabricate a revision. To prevent that, she inserted a dual lock mechanism. An irrevocable trust in the state of Nevada cannot be amended by the grantor alone. It requires the physical, countersigned consent of the independent fiduciary. I looked at Valerie, watching her chest rise and fall in shallow, erratic breaths. Harrison Reed has managed this portfolio since its inception, I said. His signature is required on any structural change. I do not see his name on this page. I do not see his seal. Even if the notary stamp was valid, this document is a legal fiction. It holds no power in a court of law. It holds no power in a bank. I placed my fingertips against the edge of the stapled packet. I applied a fraction of pressure, sliding the forged amendment across the smooth wood. The paper glided over the surface and stopped directly in front of Valerie. "Take it," I instructed. Valerie stared at the packet as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. Her hands remained frozen at her sides. The crimson coat she wore suddenly looked too large for her shrinking frame. "You did not bring leverage into my home," I said, delivering the final assessment. "You brought evidence of a federal crime." Presenting a fabricated legal instrument to a commercial lender across state lines constitutes wire fraud. Using it to secure $45 million is bank fraud. Using it to threaten me in my own living room is extortion. You handed a forensic auditor a felony confession. Valerie took a shuddering breath. Her pristine makeup could not hide the pallor of her skin. The bravado she carried across the threshold had evaporated. Narcissists operate on the illusion of invulnerability. When that illusion shatters, they do not fight. They panic. "Get out of my apartment," I said. I pointed toward the open doorway where the harsh corridor light spilled onto my rug. Skylar did not need to be told twice. She turned on her heel, her designer boots clicking rapidly against the hardwood. She bypassed her mother, bypassed Richard, and practically ran into the hallway, eager to escape the collapsing blast radius. Valerie hesitated. Her pride waged a brief, futile war against her terror. She reached out with a trembling hand, snatched the forged document off the counter, and shoved it into her leather handbag. She did not offer a parting threat. She did not promise to destroy me. She turned away, her posture rigid but brittle, and walked out the door. The sound of her frantic footsteps echoed down the exterior stairwell, fading into the night. The apartment emptied, leaving a vacuum of displaced air. But the front door did not close. I looked toward the entryway. Richard was still standing inside my living room. His hands were no longer buried in his pockets. They hung loosely at his sides, the fingers twitching with a nervous, restless energy. He looked old. The tailored slacks and expensive blazer he wore could not conceal the heavy toll of his choices. My father had spent his entire adulthood seeking shelter from conflict. He married my mother because she was a builder, a woman who paved the road ahead of him so he never had to clear the brush himself. When she died, the road ended. He panicked. He found Valerie, a woman who offered a different kind of shelter. Valerie provided a curated life, a society calendar, and a hotel brand that ran on autopilot. All Richard had to do was surrender his spine. He traded his daughter for a quiet study and a poured glass of scotch. Now the shelter was burning down around him. "Dad," I said, my voice softer now, stripped of the forensic edge, "it is over. Go home." He took a slow step forward. The floorboard groaned beneath his leather shoe. He did not look angry. He looked devastated. His eyes traced the perimeter of my modest living room, taking in the thrifted bookshelves, the simple area rug, the ceramic tea mug on the counter. For 14 years, he had ignored my existence in Reno, choosing to believe I was doing fine because investigating the truth required effort. Confronting my reality meant confronting his own failure. "Leah," he whispered, his voice cracked, dry, and thin. I stood by the kitchen island, maintaining my distance. I waited. He took another step, entering the faint pool of light cast by the kitchen pendants. A single tear broke over his lower lid, tracking a slow path down his weathered cheek. It was the first time I had seen him cry since the morning of my mother's funeral. "I did not know about the notary," Richard said, his voice trembling. "I swear to you, I did not know the document was a forgery until tonight. Valerie handled the lawyers. She told me she found an old file. She told me it was legitimate." "Ignorance is not an alibi," I replied. "You presented it to a judge. You let her bring it here." I was scared he admitted the confession spilling out of him in a rushed, pathetic breath. The investors were calling. The bank was threatening to pull the capital. We were going to lose everything. "You are going to lose it anyway," I said. "The default stands. The lease is terminated." Richard shook his head, a desperate, pleading motion. "No, please, Leah, listen to me." He reached out his hand, hovering in the empty space between us. Asking for a bridge, I was not willing to build. He had stood by while his wife ordered a security guard to put his hands on me. He had stood by while she tried to blackmail me with prison time. He only found his voice when the threat turned toward his own comfort. "If you expose this forgery to the bank," Richard said, the tears flowing freely, now pooling in the deep creases around his mouth. "If you show that notary stamp to the underwriter tomorrow, Valerie will go to federal prison. The fraud charges will ruin us. The scandal will wipe out the accounts. She will leave me, Leah. I will be bankrupt. I will be alone." He took a final, halting step closer. He looked at me not as a father looking at his child, but as a drowning man looking at a life raft. "I am asking you for one last favor," he pleaded, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Just let us have the loan. Let the wire transfer clear. Drop the eviction. Be reasonable. You have your life up here. You do not need the hotel. Please, Leah, do not destroy my family." The word hung in the quiet apartment, a heavy, toxic weight. Family. He was asking me to set myself on fire to keep his fraudulent empire warm. He was asking me to validate the erasure of my mother's legacy, to protect the woman who tried to destroy it. The ultimate test of my boundaries stood right in front of me, crying in my living room. The silence in the kitchen expanded, heavy and dense, pressing against the walls of my apartment. I watched the tear track a slow, jagged path down my father's weathered cheek. He stood there, a fractured man, begging his discarded daughter to absorb the collateral damage of his cowardice. He did not offer an apology for the forgery. He did not express remorse for the home invasion. He did not acknowledge the agonizing reality that he had just watched his wife threaten me with federal prison. He only cared about the fallout. He wanted me to act as the shock absorber for the explosive consequences of Valerie's ambition. "Please, Leah," Richard whispered again. His shoulders rounded, curving inward as if he were trying to physically shrink himself to avoid the impending impact. "Do not destroy my family." A memory ignited behind my eyes, vivid and sharp. It was not a distant childhood recollection. It was a memory from 24 hours ago. I was standing in the grand lobby of the Solstice, wearing a silk gown, waiting for a single word of defense. The security guard's hand was clamped tight around my arm, the fabric digging into my skin. The investors were watching. Valerie was delivering her execution order. I looked directly at my father, silently begging him to intervene. He met my gaze for 2 seconds. Then he looked down at the melting ice in his scotch glass. He chose the quiet comfort of his drink over the public humiliation of his own flesh and blood. He did not defend me when the stakes were low. Now, with a $45 million fraud charge hovering over his head, he wanted me to sacrifice my mother's legacy to shield him from the storm. The emotional tether that had anchored me to Richard for 34 years finally snapped. It did not break with a loud, dramatic rupture. It dissolved quietly, turning to dust in the cool air of my Reno apartment. I looked at him, and I did not see a father. I saw a tenant who was delinquent on his rent. "I am not destroying your family," I said. My voice was gentle, devoid of anger or malice. I maintained a level, resonant tone, speaking to him the way you might speak to a stranger who is lost. Valerie destroyed the family the moment she walked into this room with a fabricated legal instrument. I am merely the auditor, reviewing the damage. Richard shook his head, a frantic side-to-side motion. He took a step closer, raising his hands in a posture of desperate supplication. "No, you can fix this. You just have to withdraw the default. Let the loan process. The bank will issue the funds, we will build the Henderson property, and Valerie will leave the original hotel alone. We can draft a new agreement next month. You will get everything. Just give me this one night. Be reasonable." Be reasonable. The phrase was a weapon he had wielded against me since I was a teenager. When Valerie moved Skylar into the master bedroom and relegated me to the cramped guest quarters next to the garage, Richard told me to be reasonable. When Valerie removed my mother's photographs from the hallway mantels, he told me to be reasonable. It was his universal translation for, endure the pain so I do not have to endure the conflict. I looked at the butcher block island. I looked at the space where the forged document had rested moments earlier. "You rented my silence for 14 years, I said, shifting my gaze back to his tear-streaked face. "You paid for your comfort with my absence. You let Valerie erase my mother's name from the wall, and you let her erase me from your life. I accepted the arrangement because I believed you were a good man trapped in a difficult marriage. I was wrong. You are not trapped. You are compliant." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the words withered on his tongue. The absolute certainty in my voice paralyzed him. "The lease is up, Dad," I told him, delivering the final assessment. "The arrangement is over. I am not withdrawing the default. I am not validating a forgery. I am enforcing the truth. And the truth is that you do not own the ground you are standing on." I stepped around the kitchen island. I walked toward the open front door, my footsteps steady and deliberate against the hardwood floor. The harsh corridor light cast a long shadow across the entryway rug. I stopped by the doorframe and looked back at him. "Go home, Richard," I commanded softly. "The meeting in Chicago is scheduled for 9 in the morning. You are going to need your rest." He stared at me, his eyes wide and hollow. He searched my face for a flicker of hesitation, a crack in the armor, a lingering trace of the obedient daughter he used to manage. He found nothing. I was a blank ledger. He slowly lowered his hands. The fight drained out of his posture, leaving him hollowed out and defeated. He did not offer a goodbye. He turned around, his movements sluggish and mechanical, and shuffled toward the door. He crossed the threshold, stepping out of my apartment and into the sterile hallway. I placed my hand on the brass knob. I did not slam the door. I closed it with a firm, deliberate push, guiding the heavy wood until the latch clicked securely into the frame. I turned the deadbolt, sliding the metal cylinder home with a sharp, metallic snap. The apartment plunged back into profound silence. The invasion was over. My perimeter was secure. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door for exactly 10 seconds. I allowed myself to process the physical toll of the encounter, the adrenaline tremor in my hands, the tight aching knot in my shoulders, the sheer emotional exhaustion of severing the final tie to a parent. I breathed in the scent of chamomile and old paper. Then I pushed off the door. The time for mourning a relationship that never truly existed had passed. I had a deadline to meet and a federal loan scheme to dismantle. I walked back to the kitchen counter and picked up my phone. The screen illuminated, displaying the time. It was approaching 2 in the morning. The closing meeting with the commercial lender was scheduled for 9. I had exactly 7 hours to cross the state of Nevada and intercept the wire transfer. I unlocked a device and scrolled through the contact list. I tapped Harrison Reed's name. The phone rang twice before he answered. He did not sound asleep. He sounded like a man who had been pacing a floor, calculating liability scenarios. Leah Harrison said, his voice clipped and urgent. "Tell me you are all right. I just received an alert that Valerie's legal team submitted the temporary injunction to the Chicago underwriter. They are accelerating the closing timeline." "I am fine," I replied, walking into my bedroom to grab my travel bag. Valerie just left my apartment. She brought the First Amendment with her. She tried to use it to extort a waiver of my succession rights. Extortion. Harrison hissed the word, carrying a sharp edge of professional outrage. "I will call the police right now. We file a report." "We do not need the police," I said, tossing a clean blouse into the open duffel bag on my bed. "The amendment is a forgery, Harrison. It is a fabricated document." Valerie's lawyer backdated the text to 2012, but he was sloppy. He authenticated the signature using a Washoe County notary stamp. I recognized the clerk's name. The notary did not receive his state commission until 2015. The stamp is a physical impossibility. The entire filing is a federal crime. The line went completely silent. I could picture Harrison in his office, pausing his pacing, his legal mind rapidly processing the catastrophic implications of a fraudulent notary seal submitted in a commercial loan application. A forged notary on a federal wire transfer? Harrison murmured the disbelief evident in his tone. She crossed state lines with a fabricated legal instrument. If she presents that document to the bank in the morning, she is committing bank fraud in real time. She intends to present it, I confirmed, zipping the duffel bag closed. She believes the injunction gives her cover. She thinks I am trapped up here, paralyzed by the court order. She assumes the underwriter will glance at the signature, verify the injunction, and clear the $45 million before the sun sets. We have to notify the judge. Harrison started the adrenaline bleeding back into his voice. We file an emergency motion to quash the injunction based on fraudulent evidence. "A judge will take 3 days to review the motion," I interrupted, swinging the strap of the bag over my shoulder. "We do not have 3 days. By the time a clerk stamps our filing, the money will be in Valerie's operating account. The commercial lien will attach to the hotel. The damage will be done." "We are not fighting this in a courtroom, Harrison. We are taking the fight directly to the source." I walked out of the bedroom, turning off the overhead light. I grabbed my keys from the ceramic bowl by the front door. "What are you suggesting?" Harrison asked. "Book me a seat on the first commercial flight out of Reno," I instructed, pulling the front door open. "I want a ticket on the red-eye to McCarran International. Arrange for a car to meet me on the tarmac. Then call the Chicago underwriter. Do not mention the forgery. Do not mention the police. Tell the bank that the successor trustee is flying down to Vegas to attend the final closing meeting in person." Harrison paused. "You want to crash the closing." "Leah Valerie will have a team of corporate litigators in that room. I do not care if she brings an army," I said, locking the deadbolt behind me. "I have the state registry records, I have the master lease, and I have the truth. Book the flight, Harrison. We are going to blow up the vault." The descent into McCarran International Airport was a turbulent plunge through the early morning thermal currents. I stared out the oval window of the commercial jet, watching the neon grid of Las Vegas emerge from the dark, sprawling expanse of the Mojave Desert. The city glowed with an artificial, relentless energy. It was a metropolis built entirely on the concept of risk and illusion. Millions of people traveled here every year, hoping to beat the mathematical odds, relying on luck to secure a fortune. I did not rely on luck. I relied on the paper. The landing gear hit the tarmac with a heavy, reverberating thud. I checked the digital clock on my phone screen. 7:30 in the morning. The closing meeting was scheduled to commence in 90 minutes at the regional headquarters of the Chicago commercial lender, located in a high-rise tower just off the Central Strip. I unbuckled my seatbelt, grabbed my duffel bag from the overhead compartment, and navigated the crowded aisle. The terminal was a sensory assault of ringing slot machines and loud announcements, a stark contrast to the quiet, methodical focus I had maintained since leaving Reno. Harrison had followed my instructions flawlessly. A black town car waited at the curb outside baggage claim. The driver held a small placard bearing my last name. I slid into the leather back seat. A thick, sealed envelope rested on the upholstery beside me. I tore the flap open. Inside were the certified documents I had requested Harrison pull from the state registry, the official Washoe County commissioning records for David Aris, the notary public, the irrefutable state-sanctioned proof that Valerie's legal instrument was a fabricated lie. I placed the records into my leather briefcase, snapping the brass latches shut. The drive to the commercial district took 20 minutes. We pulled up to a towering glass and steel structure that reflected the rising Nevada sun. Harrison Reed stood near the revolving doors, adjusting the lapels of his tailored suit. He looked tense, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I stepped out of the car. The morning heat was already beginning to bake the concrete. "Are you absolutely certain about the notary dates?" Harrison asked as I approached. He did not bother with a greeting. His legal mind was already calculating the catastrophic liability we were about to introduce into a federal banking transaction. If we walk into that room and interrupt a $45 million wire transfer with a false accusation, the bank will bury us in retaliatory litigation. "I am certain," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "The documents are in the briefcase. The state seal confirms the timeline. Valerie is holding a forged document." Harrison nodded a slow, grim acknowledgement of the impending destruction. "The lead underwriter is a man named Sterling," he said, guiding me through the revolving doors and into the expansive marble-floored lobby. "Sterling is a veteran compliance officer. He is cautious, meticulous, and utterly devoid of a sense of humor. He expects a smooth execution today. He is completely unaware of the forgery." Valerie convinced him the injunction is a standard family dispute resolution. We rode the high-speed elevator to the 42nd floor. The brass indicator chimed softly as we ascended. They secured the primary executive boardroom. Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "The high society investors from the Gala are present. The hotel board is present. Valerie brought her crisis litigation team. Richard is there. They are currently reviewing the final amortization schedules. The wire transfer authorization is the final document in the stack." The elevator doors glided open, revealing a plush, hushed reception area. A heavy set of double oak doors stood at the end of the corridor, flanked by 2 security guards in dark suits. The muffled hum of conversation leaked through the wood, a low, confident murmur of wealthy individuals preparing to finalize a lucrative deal. I walked past the receptionist. I did not slow my pace. I approached the oak doors, my leather briefcase heavy in my hand. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was one of triumphant relief. The long mahogany table was covered in neat stacks of legal paper, crystal water pitchers, and silver pens. Valerie sat near the head of the table, flanked by her attorneys. She wore a pristine white suit, her posture immaculate, radiating the quiet grace of a woman who had weathered a storm and emerged victorious. She was currently in the middle of a masterful performance. "I apologize for the minor delay yesterday, gentlemen," Valerie was saying, her voice projected with perfect modulation to reach the far ends of the room. She directed her attention to a row of older distinguished investors sitting opposite the bank executives. "Family business can occasionally become complicated. My stepdaughter Leah has struggled for years with, well, let us call it a profound sense of estrangement. She filed a rather desperate false claim regarding the property deed in an attempt to disrupt this expansion." The investors nodded sympathetically, murmuring their understanding. They were men who dealt in capital and influence. They viewed emotional disputes as messy inconveniences to be swept aside. Thankfully, Valerie continued placing a manicured hand flat against the stapled First Amendment resting on the table in front of her. My late husband's first wife had the foresight to correct the succession plan before her passing. This 2012 trust amendment, properly notarized and filed, cleared up the confusion entirely. The court injunction merely formalized the reality we have operated under for over a decade. Richard remains the sole authority. The property title is clear. The collateral is secure. The dramatic irony hung heavy in the air, thick and intoxicating. Valerie was sitting in a room full of federal banking officials, compliance officers, and high-net-worth investors, proudly waving a felony forgery like a victory flag. She was boasting about the authenticity of a document that was a physical impossibility. She believed she had outmaneuvered the system. She thought the ink on the page was a shield. She did not realize it was a detonator. Sterling, the lead underwriter, sat at the head of the table. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and reviewed a final spreadsheet. "The explanation is satisfactory, Mrs. Irving," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "The legal department has reviewed the court injunction. We are satisfied that the temporary restraining order negates the prior notice of default. The title insurance is bound. We are prepared to execute the wire transfer." He slid a heavy, bound document across the mahogany table toward Valerie. The wire authorization form. A single signature on that page would release $45 million into the Solstice Holdings operating account, irrevocably encumbering my mother's hotel with a massive commercial lien. Valerie picked up a silver pen. She offered a gracious, practiced smile to the investors. She leaned forward, poising the nib over the signature line. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. The brass hinges groaned a sharp, metallic squeal that cut through the hushed elegance of the boardroom. The heavy doors swung wide, rebounding slightly against the corridor walls. Every head in the room snapped toward the entryway. The low murmur of conversation died instantly, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. I stepped into the room. My heels clicked against the hardwood perimeter bordering the plush carpet. Harrison Reed stepped in directly behind me, closing the oak doors with a resounding thud. Valerie's head jerked up. The pen slipped from her grasp, clattering against the mahogany table and rolling toward the crystal water pitchers. The gracious, polished smile vanished from her face, replaced by a mask of sudden, unfiltered panic. The color drained from her cheeks. Her eyes widened, darting from me to Harrison, and then to the security guard stationed outside the glass walls of the conference suite. "Security," Valerie yelled, her voice cracking, abandoning the modulated tone she had utilized moments earlier. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Security, remove her immediately. She is not supposed to be in this building. She is barred by a court injunction." Two men in dark suits moved quickly toward the boardroom doors, responding to the sudden shout. Sterling raised a single hand. The gesture was slight, but it carried the absolute authority of a man who controlled $45 million. The security guards halted in their tracks, hesitating near the threshold. The lead underwriter looked at Valerie, his brow furrowing in irritation at the sudden outburst. Then he turned his attention to me. He evaluated my posture, my calm demeanor, and the leather briefcase I carried. He was a compliance officer. He recognized the difference between a hysterical intruder and a professional arriving with a purpose. "Ms. Hamilton," Sterling said, his voice calm, cutting through the rising tension in the room. "I was informed by Mr. Reed that you requested to attend this closing. Given the active injunction against your fiduciary authority, your presence here is highly irregular." I did not break eye contact with the underwriter. I ignored Valerie's frantic gesturing. I ignored the hostile glares from her crisis litigation team. I walked toward the center of the room, stopping directly opposite Sterling. "It is irregular, Mr. Sterling," I agreed, my voice steady, projecting clearly across the expanse of the boardroom. "But I believe you will find the circumstances surrounding this loan application warrant an immediate interruption." I set my leather briefcase flat on the mahogany table. The dull thud echoed in the silent room. I placed my thumbs over the brass latches. "Do you have something to add before we close this loan?" Sterling asked, leaning back in his chair, his eyes narrowing with a mix of curiosity and deep suspicion. I clicked the brass latches open. The metallic snap sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I have a great deal to add," I replied, lifting the lid of the briefcase. "Beginning with the fact that the woman sitting to your right is attempting to secure a federal wire transfer using a fabricated legal instrument." I did not shout the accusation. I delivered the words with the flat, clinical precision of an auditor reading a discrepancy report. The statement landed in the center of the mahogany table like a live grenade. Valerie's lead crisis litigator, a man with silver hair and a severely cut suit, jumped to his feet. "Mr. Sterling, this is an outrageous slander," he barked, his face flushing dark red. "This woman is violating a direct court order by being here. We demand she be removed immediately. If she continues this baseless defamation, we will file a civil suit before the ink is dry on this loan. I ignored the lawyer entirely. Arguing with a litigator is a waste of oxygen. They are paid to generate noise and obscure the facts. I focused solely on the lead underwriter. Sterling was the arbiter of the capital. He was the only person in the room whose opinion mattered. I reached into the open briefcase and extracted a thick-bound dossier. I slid it across the polished wood. It stopped directly in front of Sterling's folded hands. "I am not offering an opinion, Mr. Sterling," I said. "I am offering a verified state record. I recommend you review the second tab before you authorize a $45 million wire transfer." Sterling looked at the dossier, then at Valerie, and finally at me. The annoyance on his face shifted into a cold professional wariness. Bankers loathe surprises at the closing table. He picked up the dossier and flipped to the second tab. The room held its collective breath. The only sound was the crisp rustle of heavy paper turning. I watched Sterling's eyes track down the page. He was reading the certified Washoe County commissioning records for David Aris, the notary public. He paused. He reread a specific paragraph. He picked up the First Amendment to the trust, resting near his own stack of documents, and compared the blue ink stamp on Valerie's paperwork against the state certification dates in my dossier. The temperature in the boardroom plummeted. The air felt suddenly dense, charged with a profound, terrifying realization. Sterling lowered the papers. He did not look angry. He looked utterly horrified. The realization that he had been minutes away from authorizing a massive federal fraud under his own credentials drained the color from his face. "Mr. Sterling," Valerie's lawyer pressed, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "Whatever she has handed you is a fabrication. We authenticated that amendment through our own channels." Sterling held up a hand, silencing the litigator, with a gesture so sharp it practically snapped. "This amendment is dated October 2012, Sterling said. His voice was a low, dangerous murmur that carried effortlessly to the far corners of the room. He tapped the blue ink stamp on the document. "It is notarized by a David Aris in Washoe County." He slid my certified dossier toward the center of the table, turning it so the investors and the bank executives could see the highlighted text. According to the official state registry, Sterling continued the syllables, dropping like stones. David Aris did not pass his notary examination until August 2015. The stamp used to authenticate this legal instrument did not exist when the document was supposedly signed. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a catastrophic collapse. The high society investors, the men and women who had nodded sympathetically at Valerie's victim routine moments earlier, leaned forward to stare at the dates. Their expressions shifted from confusion to shock and finally to unfiltered outrage. Valerie sat frozen in her chair. The pristine white suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. She opened her mouth, searching for a lie, searching for a spin, but her voice failed her. The noise she relied on her entire life could not alter the physical impossibility of the ink. She presented a forged document to secure this loan, Sterling stated, looking directly at Valerie's legal team. He was no longer addressing a client. He was addressing a criminal liability. "You submitted a fabricated legal instrument to a federally insured institution." Valerie's lawyer looked at the dates. He looked at Valerie. He stepped back from his chair, physically distancing himself from his client. "I was provided that document by Mrs. Irving," the lawyer stammered, abandoning his aggressive posture instantly. "My firm did not authenticate the seal. We relied on the client's representation." The betrayal was swift and absolute. In the corporate world, loyalty extends only as far as the liability perimeter. Valerie was suddenly entirely alone. The investors at the far end of the table began packing their briefcases. A prominent venture capitalist from Chicago, a man Valerie had courted relentlessly for 2 years, stood up. He did not yell. He did not demand an explanation. He looked at Valerie with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "This meeting is over," the investor said, signaling to his associates. "We are pulling our capital commitments immediately. I will be contacting my own legal counsel regarding the misrepresentations made during the prospectus phase." Valerie snapped out of her paralysis. The prospect of losing her social standing, of being humiliated in front of the very peers she idolized, broke through her shock. She stood up, her hands trembling violently. "Wait," she cried, her voice pitching upward, frantic and desperate. "Please, there is a mistake. The lawyer made a mistake. I did not know about the stamp." "Richard," she turned to my father, who was sitting near the back wall. "Richard, tell them I found the file in your study. Tell them it was real." The boardroom turned their collective gaze to Richard Irving. My father looked at the men in the expensive suits. He looked at the bank executives. He looked at the forged document resting on the mahogany table. The weight of his entire life, a life spent avoiding difficult choices and enabling destructive behavior to preserve his own comfort, finally crushed him. He did not speak. He did not defend her. He looked at Valerie, his eyes filled with a pathetic, hollow sorrow. Then he looked down at the floor. He looked away from her, just as he had looked away from me at the gala. The symmetry of the betrayal was a breathtaking piece of poetic justice. Valerie had built an empire by isolating people, by relying on Richard's cowardly silence to enforce her will. Now, that same cowardly silence was the final nail in her own coffin. Sterling stood up from the head of the table. He gathered the loan documents, the wire transfer authorization, and the forged amendment, placing them into a secure file. "Nobody leaves this room," Sterling commanded. His tone was authoritative, brooking no argument. He pointed a finger directly at Valerie's crisis litigator. "You and your client will remain seated. I am instructing bank security to lock down this floor. We are contacting the federal compliance authorities and the regional fraud division immediately." The reality of the situation crashed over Valerie. The social humiliation was no longer her primary concern. The word federal hung in the air, a terrifying specter of orange jumpsuits and concrete cells. She collapsed back into her chair. The immaculate posture crumpled. She covered her face with her hands, and a harsh, ragged sob tore from her throat. The investors filed out of the room, eager to escape the contamination zone. The bank executives moved to the perimeter, speaking in hushed, urgent tones into their cellular devices. I stood by the table, my briefcase open. I watched the empire burn. I did not feel a rush of triumphant joy. I did not feel the urge to gloat. I felt a profound, settling peace. The long, exhausting war of attrition was finally over. The boundary had been drawn, and the invaders had been expelled. Valerie lowered her hands. Her pristine makeup was ruined, streaked with dark tears. She looked up at me. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the raw, desperate hatred of a trapped animal. "You took everything from me," she whispered, her voice a ragged, wet rasp. "You took my hotel, you took my brand, you took my life." I looked down at her. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "I did not take anything, Valerie," I said. "You built a life on a foundation that did not belong to you. You relied on my silence to sustain the illusion. I simply stopped being quiet. The hotel was never yours. The money was never yours." I closed the lid of my briefcase and secured the brass latches. "But since you removed the silver plaque from the lobby," I continued, my tone shifting, hardening into steel. "Since you triggered the uncurable default provision in the master lease, and since you attempted to collateralize my property with a fabricated legal instrument, the operating company is formally evicted." I picked up my briefcase. I looked at the ruined woman sitting in the chair. "I did not take anything today, Valerie, but I am about to." The mahogany boardroom felt colder now, stripped of the vibrant energy the investors had brought with them. The federal bankers stood near the glass walls, murmuring into their phones, coordinating the arrival of the compliance authorities. Harrison Reed remained by my side, his posture rigid, a silent sentry guarding the perimeter of my newly secured territory. Valerie stared at me. the tears drying on her cheeks, leaving dark, jagged streaks through her foundation. Her breathing was ragged, shallow gasps of air that barely filled her lungs. She was waiting for the final strike. She knew the loan was dead. She knew the fraud was exposed. But she still clung to the desperate hope that she could maintain control of the operating company, that she could retreat to the solstice and barricade herself inside her office until the legal storm passed. I was about to dismantle that final illusion. Pursuant to the notice of default submitted to this institution yesterday, I began, my voice clear and resonant in the quiet room. And in light of the material uncurable breach regarding the removal of the historical marker from the main lobby, the master lease between the trust and the operating company is formally terminated. Valerie flinched as if I had struck her across the face. "You cannot do that," she choked out her voice, a fragile, desperate whisper. "You cannot just take the hotel. The brand is mine. I designed the menus. I hired the staff. I built the reputation. The solstice is nothing without me." She was bargaining with a ghost. The brand, the menus, the reputation, they were all intangible assets built on a foundation she did not own. Effective immediately, I continued, ignoring her plea. "The operating company is evicted from the premises. You are stripped of all managerial authority. You no longer have access to the corporate accounts, the vendor contracts, or the physical building. The trust is assuming full operational control." A sharp, guttural scream tore from Valerie's throat. It was not a scream of anger. It was the primal sound of a woman watching her entire identity evaporate. "I gave you 14 years, Valerie shrieked, slamming her palms flat against the mahogany table. "I gave you my youth. I rebuilt that tired, rotting building. I made it a luxury destination. I have nothing left. You are leaving me with nothing." Her litigator shifted uncomfortably in his chair, averting his eyes. He recognized the futility of her outburst. The legal mechanisms were locked. The eviction was absolute. I looked at the ruined woman across the table. A lesser person might have felt the urge to grind her into the dust. A lesser person might have seized the opportunity to strip Valerie of every asset she possessed, to leave her destitute on the streets of Henderson as vengeance for the 14 years of quiet cruelty. I possessed the legal authority to do exactly that. But my mother did not teach me to be cruel. She taught me to be exact. "I do not want to destroy you, Valerie," I said, my tone softening slightly, shedding the forensic edge. "Destruction is messy. It breeds resentment and endless litigation. I prefer a clean sever." Valerie stopped screaming. She looked up, a glimmer of confused hope piercing through the panic in her eyes. She was a woman who only understood transactional relationships. She assumed I was about to offer a negotiation. "The trust does not just hold the deed to the solstice," I stated, measuring my words carefully. "It also owns the residential parcel in Henderson, the sprawling 6-bedroom mansion you and Richard currently occupy. My mother purchased that land 3 decades ago as a secondary investment. The trust pays the property taxes. The trust holds the title." Richard, still sitting near the back wall, let out a low, shuddering breath. He understood the implications before Valerie did. He knew that the ground beneath his own bed did not belong to him. "I could issue a 30-day notice to vacate the residence today," I told her. "I could seize the luxury vehicles parked in the garage as they were purchased through the operating company's capital accounts. I could leave you with nothing but the clothes you are wearing and the legal fees you are about to incur." Valerie swallowed hard, her throat working against the sudden terror of total financial ruin. She was staring at the abyss. "But I will not," I said. The silence in the room stretched taut, thick with anticipation. "You can keep the mansion in Henderson," I declared, delivering the terms of her surrender. "I will instruct Harrison to draft a quitclaim deed, transferring the residential title into your name, free and clear of the trust. You can keep the vehicles. You can keep the personal accounts. You can maintain your physical comfort." Valerie blinked, the confusion deepening. She could not comprehend mercy. She could not understand why I was handing her a multi-million-dollar lifeline, after she had tried to orchestrate my imprisonment. "Consider it your severance package," I explained, leaning forward slightly, resting my hands on the leather briefcase. "You dedicated 14 years to managing the hotel. The trust is compensating you for your time. You will not face bankruptcy. You will not face the streets." A slow, profound realization dawned in Valerie's eyes. The glimmer of hope vanished, replaced by a horror far deeper than financial ruin. She recognized the architecture of the cage I had just constructed around her. Narcissists do not fear poverty as much as they fear irrelevance. By allowing her to keep the mansion, I was trapping her inside a gilded prison. She would return to her sprawling Henderson estate, surrounded by expensive furniture and luxury cars, but she would be entirely stripped of her power. She would no longer possess the hotel. She would no longer command a staff. She would no longer receive invitations to high society galas or sit in corporate boardrooms. The investors who had just walked out the door would shun her. The charity boards she chaired would quietly ask for her resignation once the federal fraud investigation became public knowledge. She would sit in her massive, quiet house, trapped with a cowardly husband who had failed to defend her, entirely isolated from the social hierarchy that defined her existence. It was a punishment far more exquisite than absolute ruin. It was a life sentence of luxurious irrelevance. "But there is one condition attached to this severance," I added, my voice dropping to a low, unforgiving register. "You will never step foot on the property of the Solstice again. You are formally trespassed from the premises. If you attempt to enter the lobby, approach the staff, or interfere with the transition of power, I will rescind the residential deed, and I will pursue the eviction with extreme prejudice." Valerie stared at me, the finality of the arrangement sinking into her bones. She had no leverage left to negotiate. She had no brand to protect. She was a queen exiled from her own kingdom, banished to a comfortable, silent exile. She slowly lowered her head, breaking eye contact. She stared at the polished mahogany table, the fight completely extinguished from her posture. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom opened. The bank's security personnel had arrived. But they were not the only ones. A man in a dark, tailored uniform stepped through the threshold, his presence commanding immediate attention. I recognized him instantly. He was the head of security for the Solstice, the exact same man Valerie had ordered to grab my arm and remove me from the anniversary gala 48 hours ago. He did not look at me. He kept his gaze focused straight ahead, his expression neutral and professional. He walked past the federal compliance officers, past Harrison Reed, and stopped directly behind Valerie's chair. He leaned down slightly. His voice was low, but it carried clearly across the quiet room. "Ma'am," the security guard said, echoing the exact phrasing he had used on me 2 nights prior. "I need to escort you off the property." 7 days passed before I returned to Las Vegas. The brutal summer heat remained unchanged, baking the asphalt of the highway and creating shimmering mirages across the desert floor. But the atmosphere inside my own mind was entirely different. The persistent low-frequency anxiety that had hummed in my chest for over a decade was gone. I drove south with the windows up, the air conditioning running, listening to the steady rhythm of the tires against the pavement. I was not driving toward a confrontation. I was driving toward a reclamation. I pulled my car into the VIP parking sector of the Solstice. The valet stand was fully staffed, operating with a crisp, renewed efficiency. The attendant opened my door. He did not ask for my ticket or question my presence. He addressed me by my last name, offered a polite nod, and took the keys. News travels fast within the hospitality industry. Every employee in the building knew the hierarchy had shifted. They knew the era of vanity projects and screaming matches in the executive suites had ended. I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the grand lobby. The space was a cacophony of controlled destruction. A team of private contractors occupied the main floor, surrounded by scaffolding and heavy canvas drop cloths. The sharp whine of power drills and the heavy thud of falling metal echoed off the vaulted ceilings. They were dismantling the sterile, reflective chrome panels Valerie had installed 6 months prior. The cheap veneer was coming down, exposing the original, rugged, desert stone underneath. Dust motes danced in the shafts of morning light filtering through the tall windows. It smelled like plaster ozone and progress. I bypassed the construction zone and walked toward the administrative wing. The hallway leading to the executive offices was quiet, insulated from the noise of the lobby renovations. The heavy mahogany doors were propped open. I stopped at the threshold of the creative director's suite. Skylar stood in the center of the room. She wore faded denim and a plain gray sweater, a stark departure from the designer couture she usually paraded around the property. A stack of brown corrugated cardboard boxes rested on the polished floor. She was wrapping a gilded desk lamp in tissue paper, her movements slow and lethargic. I leaned against the doorframe and watched her. I did not speak. I simply allowed my presence to fill the room. Skylar paused. She turned around, clutching the wrapped lamp to her chest. The arrogant entitlement that had fueled her midnight ambush at my apartment was nowhere to be found. Her face was pale, drawn tight, with the exhaustion of a reality she could no longer manipulate. She had spent her entire adult life playing a role funded by an account she never earned. Now the account was closed. The stage was being dismantled. She opened her mouth, perhaps to offer a hollow apology, or perhaps to hurl one final bitter insult. I held her gaze, my expression perfectly neutral. The silence stretched between us, heavy and impenetrable. She recognized there was no currency left to trade. My boundaries were solid concrete. Words could not breach them. Skylar lowered her eyes, placed the lamp into the cardboard box, and folded the flaps shut. She lifted the heavy carton and walked toward the exit. A figure stepped out from the adjacent corridor. It was the same security supervisor who had stood in the bank boardroom. He moved with a quiet, imposing grace, holding a clipboard containing an exit checklist. He fell into step behind Skylar, maintaining a professional distance, ensuring her departure was orderly and final. The symmetry of the moment was profound. She was walking out the door under the exact same escort her mother had weaponized against me. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I stepped aside, giving her the space to leave my property forever. I turned my attention to the heavy bundle resting under my arm. It was wrapped in deep blue velvet, tied securely with a thick silk cord. I had spent the previous afternoon tracking the object down. Valerie had not ordered it destroyed. She was too careless for that. She simply wanted it out of her sight. I found it buried in a subterranean utility closet near the industrial laundry facilities, shoved behind a stack of broken banquet chairs and forgotten maintenance supplies. I walked back down the corridor, emerging into the grand lobby. The contractors had finished stripping the central alcove. The raw, textured desert stone breathed again, freed from its reflective prison. I set the bundle on a sturdy wooden staging table. I untied the silk cord and peeled back the layers of heavy velvet. The Nevada Silver founding plaque lay heavy on the fabric. It was badly tarnished. The edges were dark oxidized from months of neglect in a damp basement. But the core integrity of the metal remained flawless. The deep engraved letters, spelling my mother's name and the founding date, were unyielding. It was a testament to her philosophy. A legacy built on solid ground might lose its shine, but it cannot be easily broken. I picked up the plaque. The silver was cool and dense against my palms. I carried it toward the exposed stone alcove. The noise in the lobby began to subside. The contractors lowered their drills. The front desk staff paused their typing. A quiet ripple of awareness moved through the room. Several veteran employees, men and women, who had worked the floors during my mother's tenure, stepped out from the corridors and gathered near the perimeter of the construction zone. An older concierge named Thomas, a man who used to slip me peppermint candies when I did my homework in the back offices 30 years ago, stepped forward. He held a brass mounting bracket and a heavy mallet. He did not say a word. He offered a slow, deeply respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the restoration. Together we aligned the heavy silver plaque against the desert stone. Thomas secured the anchor bolts, his hands moving with practiced precision. The metal settled into its original position, fitting the grooves of the stone perfectly. The ghost of the founder had returned, anchoring the building once more. I stepped back, running my fingers over the engraved letters. The cold metal grounded me. The hotel was safe. My work for the day was far from over. I left the lobby and took the private elevator to the top-floor penthouse boardroom. A team of executives waited for me around a circular glass table. They were not local vendors or family acquaintances. They represented a premier global hospitality management firm based out of New York. I had spent the past 5 days conducting a rigorous forensic review of their operational history, their financial solvency, and their compliance records. They were professionals who dealt in high-yield luxury assets. I took my seat at the head of the table. I opened my leather briefcase and produced the new master lease agreement. I did not draft a standard contract. I applied every skill I possessed as an auditor to build an ironclad fortress around the property. The new lease mandated strict, unyielding adherence to the aesthetic covenants. It required independent quarterly forensic audits, which my own firm in Reno would oversee. It established a zero-tolerance policy for unauthorized structural alterations. In exchange for operational control, the management group agreed to pay a substantial premium directly into the PropCo trust. The lead executive reviewed the terms. He did not argue. He recognized the value of the asset and the uncompromising nature of the landlord sitting across from him. He signed the final page in black ink, pushing the document across the glass for my countersignature. The transition of power was complete. The $18 million reserve account remained untouched, shielded by legal armor. The new revenue stream would guarantee the hotel's maintenance and profitability for decades to come. I walked out of the boardroom holding the first certified rent check. The numbers printed on the paper represented a fortune, but the money itself held no emotional weight for me. My quiet life in Reno provided everything I required. I did not desire a mansion in Henderson or a fleet of imported vehicles. Wealth is only useful when it serves a purpose beyond mere accumulation. I returned to the executive suite sitting behind the large desk that had sat empty since Valerie's eviction. I opened my laptop and initiated a wire transfer. I bypassed my personal accounts entirely. I routed the funds to a newly incorporated charitable foundation, the Diane Hamilton Endowment. I drafted the charter documents as the sun began to set over the Las Vegas skyline. The endowment was designed with a singular, unbreakable directive. The funds would provide full academic scholarships for young women residing in Nevada who were pursuing degrees in finance, accounting, and legal compliance. I wanted to equip the next generation with the tools to decipher complex ledgers, to spot the anomalies in a contract, and to recognize a forged signature. I wanted to teach them the lesson I had learned through 14 years of endurance. I wanted them to understand that shouting matches and dramatic confrontations are the tactics of the weak. True power lies in the fine print. I finalized the electronic transfer. The first month of operational rent vanished from the ledger, converted instantly into tuition grants for students I would likely never meet. I closed the laptop. The office was quiet. The perimeter was secured. I had established my boundaries, dismantled an empire of lies, and cemented a legacy that could never be erased. I sat back in the leather chair looking out the tall windows at the neon lights flickering to life across the desert grid. I felt a profound, enduring peace. The morning sun crusted the Sierra Nevada mountains, casting long, pale rays of light through the window of my Reno apartment. The beams caught the dust motes suspended in the cool, still air, turning them into drifting specks of gold. I stood in the center of my small kitchen, listening to the familiar, comforting hum of the electric kettle. The floorboards beneath my feet creaked a low, welcoming note as I shifted my weight. It was a Tuesday. Down in Las Vegas, the hospitality industry was already churning through its frantic daily routine. Valets were rushing to meet arriving luxury sedans. Executives were crowding into glass conference rooms to debate quarterly projections. The solstice was waking up under new management, humming with the profitable efficiency of a carefully structured corporate machine. The endowment I funded was already processing its first round of scholarship applications, preparing to alter the trajectories of young women I would never meet. But up here in northern Nevada, the world moved at a different, deliberate pace. I poured boiling water into my ceramic mug. The scent of roasted green tea and toasted rice filled the kitchen. I carried the mug into my living room and set it down on my workspace. I did not purchase a larger apartment. I did not upgrade my furniture or lease a foreign sports car. The $18 million reserve account remained securely locked inside the trust, generating quiet interest, acting as a permanent, impenetrable fortress around my mother's legacy. My personal life required no such extravagance. The space I occupied was exactly the size I needed it to be. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated, casting a soft blue glow across the wood grain. Resting right beside my trackpad, catching a glint of the morning sun, was the brass safety deposit key. I reached out and traced the jagged teeth of the metal. For 14 years, it had lived inside the dark confines of my glove compartment, wrapped in blue linen, waiting for the trigger. Now it served a different purpose. It was no longer a dormant weapon. It was a paperweight. It held down a stack of incoming compliance files I needed to review before lunch. The key had done its job, unlocking a truth that reset the entire axis of my existence. I moved my hand back to the keyboard and opened the first file of the day. It was a routine municipal audit for a regional gaming vendor. The task was thoroughly mundane. I scanned the digital ledger, my eyes tracking down the columns, comparing the reported revenue against the state tax disbursements, line by line, row by row. A small smile touched the corners of my mouth. I loved this work. I loved the cold, undeniable geometry of numbers. People lie. Relatives lie. Corporate litigators and high society socialites build elaborate, shimmering facades to obscure their true intentions. But a ledger has no ego. A contract holds no vanity. If you trace the ink back to its source, the truth always reveals itself. I found a minor discrepancy on page 12, an equipment depreciation schedule that did not align with the original purchase dates. I highlighted the cell in bright yellow, flagged it for a secondary review, and typed a brief clinical note to the client. The satisfaction I derived from the discovery was deep and grounding. It reminded me that my identity was not tied to a hotel on the Strip, nor was it defined by the wealth I now controlled. My identity was rooted in my competence. I was a person who found the lie and corrected the record. My phone rested on the edge of the desk. The screen was dark, silent, and undisturbed. I received a brief email from Harrison Reed late last night. He provided a final factual update on the aftermath in Henderson. The Chicago commercial lender declined to press formal federal charges, preferring to bury the incident to protect their own underwriting reputation. However, they quietly placed Solstice Holdings onto an industry-wide restricted list. Valerie would never secure a line of credit from a reputable institution again. The social fallout was far more surgical. News of the fraudulent boardroom presentation leaked through the investor network. The prominent charity boards Valerie chaired convened emergency sessions and requested her immediate resignation. Her name was scrubbed from the host committees of the seasonal galas. The invitations stopped arriving in her mailbox. Harrison reported that the sprawling mansion in Henderson had become a silent tomb. Valerie and Richard remained inside, trapped together in their luxurious gilded cage. They kept their expensive vehicles and their designer wardrobes, but they possessed nowhere to go. They were isolated from the world they worshipped, surrounded by the physical artifacts of a wealth that could no longer buy them relevance. Richard was finally experiencing the true cost of his cowardice. He had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, letting his wife dictate the terms of his reality. Now he was locked in a house with a woman whose pride had been shattered, a woman who possessed nothing but resentment and time. He traded his daughter for a quiet life, only to find himself enduring the loudest, most deafening silence imaginable. I felt no lingering anger toward them. Anger is a heavy burden, and I refused to carry it any further. They were no longer characters in my narrative. I had closed their chapter, filed the paperwork, and archived the record. I took a slow sip of my tea. The warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the morning chill of the apartment. I looked out the window. Down in the neighborhood park, a group of children chased a stray dog across the frost-covered grass. The world was ordinary, resilient, and beautiful. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. I thought about the long, exhausting journey from the anniversary gala to this quiet morning in Reno. The entire ordeal had distilled my understanding of power down to a single, fundamental concept. The most potent weapon a person can wield does not reside in a bank account. It is not found in a raised voice, a tailored suit, or a threatening legal letter. The most potent weapon is the ability to remain entirely calm while the people who wronged you begin to panic. Valerie operated under the assumption that volume equaled authority. She believed that if she screamed loud enough, if she created a large enough spectacle, the world would bend to her will. She relied on the intimidation of her presence to force compliance. She mistook my quiet endurance for weakness. She assumed that because I did not fight her in the mud, I was incapable of fighting at all. She did not understand that true power operates in the margins. It sits in a diner with a black coffee reading the fine print of a master lease. It searches the state registry for a notary commission date. True power does not need to shout because the truth requires no amplification. People who steal your history, who attempt to overwrite your legacy with their own vanity, always share a common vulnerability. They focus entirely on the surface. They polish the chrome and ignore the foundation. They rely on the arrogant hope that you will be too intimidated, too tired, or too compliant to ever bother checking the math. They build their empires on the assumption that you will never read the fine print. Always read the fine print. It is where the trapdoors are hidden. It is where the escape routes are drafted. It is the exact place where your true history is recorded, waiting for you to find it. My mother knew that. She etched it into a silver plaque, buried it in a lease agreement, and locked it inside a vault until I was ready to assume the weight of it. I turned my attention back to the glowing screen of my laptop. I placed my fingers on the keyboard, ready to draft the next compliance report. The apartment was still. My perimeter was secure. The ledger of my life was finally balanced. That is my story. If you have ever had someone attempt to rewrite your place in the world, if you have ever been pushed into the shadows by a person who relies on noise to steal your light, know that your silence is not a permanent condition. You are not defeated. You just have not found your paperwork yet. Drop a comment below if you have ever outsmarted a narcissist by staying perfectly calm. Tell me about the moment you found your own trapdoor. Hit the like button to support the channel and make sure to subscribe so you never miss a case file. Keep your head clear, keep your boundaries firm, and I will see you in the next one. When we think about the inheritance we leave behind for our children, our minds naturally drift toward the tangible. We picture folded property deeds, life insurance policies, modest savings accounts, or perhaps a box of heirloom jewelry handed down through generations. In American culture, there is a profound, almost ingrained drive to ensure the next generation starts slightly further ahead than the last. We work long hours to pay for better zip codes, better schools, and safer neighborhoods. But as Leah's story so vividly illustrates, the most critical inheritance a parent can leave is rarely stored in a bank vault. The true measure of our legacy is the emotional architecture we build inside our children. It is the armor of character, the clarity of boundaries, and the quiet resilience to face a world that will not always play fair. Consider the dual legacies left to the daughters in this narrative. On one side, we have Diane, a mother who knew her time was running out. She faced the ultimate parental terror, leaving a child behind in a home that would soon be compromised. Diane could not physically remain to shield Leah from the encroaching presence of a stepmother who viewed family as a competitive sport. So Diane did something far more profound than merely leaving behind a pile of money. She left behind a master class in competence and emotional regulation. She taught Leah to read the fine print, to value the heavy, enduring nature of hard work, symbolized by the Nevada silver plaque, and to understand that true power does not require shouting. Diane instilled the ultimate American parenting value, self-reliance, grounded in absolute honesty. She did not raise a victim. She raised an auditor of truth. By teaching her daughter to stay calm while others panicked, she provided a lifelong compass. This is the essence of long-term guidance. It is not about clearing every obstacle from your child's path. It is about teaching them how to dismantle the obstacles themselves. On the other side of the spectrum, we witness the devastating failure of family responsibility modeled by Valerie and Richard. Valerie approached parenting not as a duty to raise a capable, grounded human being, but as an exercise in vanity. She raised her daughter Skylar on a diet of entitlement and superficiality. She taught Skylar that volume equates to authority, that the appearance of wealth, the polished chrome, is more important than the foundation beneath it. By shielding Skylar from consequences and modeling a life built on manipulation and forgery, Valerie ultimately left her own child defenseless. When the illusion finally shattered in that quiet Reno apartment, Skylar had no tools to cope with the reality. She was left holding a cardboard box, retreating from a world she was never truly prepared to navigate. Yet the most heartbreaking lesson in family dynamics comes from Richard. In traditional family structures, we often talk about the importance of the protective parent. We warn against malice and active cruelty. But Richard represents a different, far more common kind of danger, the passive enabler. Richard equated a quiet house with a healthy home. He prized his own comfort over his daughter's emotional safety. When Valerie slowly erased Leah from the family narrative, removing photographs and rewriting history, Richard looked away. When security guards were called to publicly humiliate his own flesh and blood, he stared at the ice in his glass. He lacked the emotional awareness to understand that his silence was a devastating endorsement of his daughter's exile. Parenting requires the courage to invite conflict when fairness demands it. It is the responsibility of the parent to stand in the gap, to enforce boundaries, and to ensure that every child under their roof feels a profound, unshakable sense of belonging. By avoiding the difficult conversations, Richard taught Leah that she was not worth the effort of an argument. He sacrificed her dignity to pay for his peace. In the end, his cowardice cost him everything. The quiet he so desperately sought morphed into a permanent, isolating silence. These contrasting approaches to family hold up a mirror to our own lives. We are raising the next generation in an era where noise, spectacle, and the illusion of success are constantly broadcasted. It is easy to get caught up in the chrome. It is easy to believe that providing material comfort fulfills the entirety of our parental obligations. But children need silver. They need parents who are willing to do the heavy, tarnishing work of emotional guidance. They need to see adults modeling honesty, even when a lie would be more convenient. They need to witness fairness being enforced at the dinner table, in the division of chores, and in the way family members speak to one another. Emotional awareness is not a modern luxury. It is the fundamental glue that keeps a traditional family structure from fracturing under pressure. We must ask ourselves what kind of armor we are forging for the people who will outlive us. Are we teaching them to shrink themselves to keep the peace, or are we teaching them to stand their ground and read the fine print? Are we showing them how to navigate conflict with grace, or are we teaching them to hide in a quiet study while the storm rages outside? Stories like Leah's resonate because they strip away the polite fictions of family life and expose the raw underlying truths of human behavior. They remind us that justice is rarely handed down. It is meticulously built, brick by brick, by those who refuse to surrender their history. If you find value in these deep dives into human psychology, family dynamics, and the quiet triumphs of the underestimated, make sure to follow the Revenge Order channel. We continue to explore the narratives that challenge our perspectives and remind us of the power of holding the line. In the end, the legacy we leave is not measured by the square footage of the estate or the balance of the trust. It is measured by the echoes of our choices reverberating in the minds of our children long after we are gone. Every conversation, every averted gaze, every boundary enforced or ignored lays a brick in the foundation of who they will become. Look closely at the foundation you are standing on today. Look at the people sitting across from you. Are you building something designed to weather the truth, or are you just renting the illusion of peace? Because eventually, the truth always comes to collect. And you have to wonder when the lease is finally up, what will be left standing in the quiet.